So, let's start the day with cooldowns. Always a good thing not to forget. Is today really the 2nd November? Feels like we're one or more days away. The transmute is ready at 5th again. In 3 days.
What's on your mind?
Well, cured rugged leather. I don't have. Oh, can stay like this. Then the warlock. Maybe I can make a little bit progress in alchemy. Therefore need
What up?
don't have enough. Hey, I should not sell this. I can use it. It will raise the damage of Immolate. Even if it's a tiny bit. It's a bit. So I need 6 more fire oil. And that means let's go with a full. Oh, that's too. Oh, that was a little bit much. Anyway. I sold yesterday the firepower potions. I should not do this. I mean, in the end, it's 35 copper each potion. Then I better can use it. So let's wait with the audiobook a little bit for today. At best I want to get a little bit of feedback. Don't know if it's possible. Especially in the weekends. It's usually the time when the viewers don't write a lot. Oh, I have only 15 minutes left on my Songflower buff, and I should not get the buff yesterday. Take the faster route. I mean, when I'm in Goro, next time I log in, don't pay out, I guess. Whatever.
Keep it real.
Where is it? In the bank?
Yo.
Yeah, but it's 275 and I'm at 68. Damn it. I need very odd herbs to go on with this. I can make greater elixir of intellect. Katka's blind weed. Need 10 or 15. I have enough Katkas by myself, only need the blind weed. 1 stack. Oh, why not? Oh wait, crystal? That can stay then.
Glad I could help.
I was hoping to... Oh no! I'm in wetlands, really? I don't have it on me. BS. Hmm, 6 days. That sends this away. But I need this. I'm bound here, right? Let's go to the bank.
Can I help you? Farewell.
I have 1 stack left here. Good news, bad news. It's enough bad news. I'm out of it then. Well, that's the only way. The only way to get up my level. In the end, I need the potions. Or I can use the potion, let's say it this way. Need is odd word. Day 9 hours. Oh, that was middle in the night. Very soon I have to farm arcane crystals again. And now using the cooldowns from 2 characters. This can go into the bank. Anything else? Not yet.
Here there.
Now that goes away. Bank is full. Merde. So I won't need King's Blood now. Let's put the 80 away. To see. Same goes for the Bruce Weed. I'm very actively looking for it. Ah. That's fine, that's fine. Ah. Good. Do I need anything other than bank? No, no. No. Good. Cooldown here used. Cooldown there checked. Warlock prepared that he has a cooldown. Mage has a cooldown at the force. No, I don't make a farm day. Must get progress. means the druid is ready again at the 5th. And for the druid, Stranglethorn into Tanaris Feralas is the plan, was the plan, still the plan, whatever. I don't see a pool. Let's check first the mailbox. Nothing is close to expire. Can go to the priest. Deep rock sold. Isn't enough. It's enough. I have enough. This is at 50 relevant. More green later. Deep rock salt. Tiny voodoo mask. I have food here. Tender wolf is the only real food I can use. Bloke. I will be the voodoo crafter here. So for all who maybe watches this on YouTube and waiting for the start of the audiobook, I'm still waiting for maybe someone who shows up. Maybe not realize that I'm online. That you get a chance. To join in. I don't know. Giant X. Why are Giant X here in my... Huh. I mean, literally, I'm nearly capped. Can make this steaks, but the rest... Give it the priest first. Let's give it the priest first.
Yeah. Hurry back.
So, what was my job here? Sunsealed. Oh, a lot of Elspiter, Troll Witchery. Bactera. Normally I should do the... Am I finished with the croc list? Looks like. Okay. I mean, I'm now 20 minutes in. I should start the audiobook. Name of the wind. Player. Chapter 21. Are you... What? That can't be true. Was 42 or something. Like this. The Bloodless. Yeah, that sounds...
Chapter 42.
That sounds familiar. I have to double check it from yesterday. I'm not totally wrong. Where's my... There we go. Okay, so 42 I listened. 43 is the one. Why you don't have fucking bookmark here? 43. Let's go.
Chapter 43.
Enjoy.
The Flickering Way. Buoyed by the stimulant effects of the Nalrus and feeling very little pain, I made my way to the archives. Since I was now a member of the Arcanum, I was free to explore the stacks, something I'd been waiting my whole life to do. Better still, so long as I didn't ask for any help from the scrivs, nothing would be recorded in the archive's ledger books. That meant I could research the Chandrian and the Amir to my heart's content, and no one, not even Lauren, need ever know about my childish pursuits. Entering the reddish light of the archives, I found both Ambrose and Faire sitting behind the entry desk. A mixed blessing, if ever there was one. Ambrose was leaning towards her, speaking in a low voice. She had the distinctly uncomfortable look of a woman who knows the futility of a polite refusal. One of his hands rested on her knee, while the other arm was draped across the back of her chair, his hand resting on her neck. He meant for it to look tender and affectionate, but there was a tension in her body like that of a startled deer. The truth was, he was holding her there, the same way you hold a dog by the scruff of its neck to keep it from running off. As the door thumped closed behind me, Faire looked up, met my eyes, then looked down and away, ashamed by her predicament. As if she'd done anything. I'd seen that look too many times on the streets of Tarbeen. It sparked an old anger in me. I approached the desk, making more noise than necessary. Pen and ink lay on the other end of the desk, and a piece of paper 3/4 full of rewriting and crossing out. From the looks of things, Ambrose had been trying to compose a poem. I reached the edge of the desk and stood for a moment. Faire looked everywhere except at me or Ambrose. She shifted in her seat, uncomfortable but obviously not wanting to make a scene. I cleared my throat pointedly. Ambrose looked over his shoulder, scowling. "You have damnable timing, Elia. Come back later." He turned away again, dismissing me. I snorted and leaned over the desk, craning my neck to look at the sheet of paper he'd left lying there. I have damnable timing? Please, you have 13 syllables in a line here. I tapped a finger onto the page. It's not iambic either. I don't know if it's anything metrical at all. He turned to look at me again, his expression irritated. Mind your tongue, Elliot. The day I come to you for help with poetry is the day you have 2 hours to spare, I said. 2 long hours, and that's just for getting started. So same can the humble thrush well know its north? I mean, I don't even know how to begin to criticize that. It practically mocks itself. What do you know of poetry? Ambrose said without bothering to turn around. I know a limping verse when I hear it, I said, but this isn't even limping. A limp has rhythm. This is more like someone falling down a set of stairs, uneven stairs, with a midden at the bottom. It is a sprung rhythm, he said, his voice stiff and offended. I wouldn't expect you to understand. Sprung? I burst out with an incredulous laugh. Ha! I understand that if I saw a horse with a leg this badly sprung, I'd kill it out of mercy, then burn its poor corpse for fear the local dogs might gnaw on it and die. Ambrose finally turned around to face me, and in so doing, he had to take his right hand off Bella's knee. A half victory, but his other hand remained on her neck, holding her in her chair with the appearance of a casual caress. I thought you might stop by today, he said with a brittle cheerfulness. So I already checked the ledger. You're not in the lists yet. You'll have to stick with tomes or come back later, after they've updated the books. No offense, but would you mind checking again? I'm not sure I can trust the literacy of someone who tries to rhyme north with worth. No wonder you have to hold women down to get them to listen to it. Ambrose stiffened, and his arm slid off the back of the chair to fall at his side. His expression was pure venom. When you're older, Elia, you'll understand that what a man and a woman do together... What? In the privacy of the entrance hall of the archives? I gestured around us. God's body, this isn't some brothel. And in case you hadn't noticed, she's a student, not some brass nail you've paid to bang away at. If you're going to force yourself on a woman, have the decency to do it in an alleyway. At least that way she'll feel justified screaming about it. Ambrose's face flushed furiously, and it took him a long moment to find his voice. You don't know the first thing about women. There, at least, we can agree, I said easily. In fact, that's the reason I came here today. I wanted to do some research, find a book or two on the subject. I struck the ledger with 2 fingers, hard. So look up my name and let me in. Ambrose flipped the book open, found the proper page, and turned the book around to face me. There. If you can find your name on that list, you're welcome to peruse the stacks at your leisure. He gave a tight smile. Otherwise, feel free to come back in a span or so. We should have things updated by then. I had the master send along a note just in case there was any confusion about my admission to the Arcanum, I said, and drew my shirt up over my head, turning so he could see the broad expanse of bandages covering my back. Can you read it from there? Or do I need to come closer? There was a pointed silence from Ambrose, so I lowered my shirt and turned to face Faire, ignoring him entirely. My Lady Scriv, I said to her with a bow. A very slight bow, as my back wouldn't permit a deep one. Would you be so good as to help me locate a book concerning women? I've been instructed by my betters to inform myself on this most subtle subject. Faire gave a faint smile and relaxed a bit. She had continued sitting stiff and uncomfortable after Ambrose had taken his hand away. I guessed that she knew Ambrose's temperament well enough to know that if she bolted away and embarrassed him, he would make her pay for it later. I don't know if you have anything like that. I would settle for a primer, I said with a smile. I have it on good report that I don't know the first thing about them, so anything would further my knowledge. Something with pictures? Ambrose spat. If our search degenerates to that level, I'll be sure to call on you, I said without looking in his direction. I smiled at Faire. Perhaps a bestiary, I said gently. I hear they are singular creatures, much different than men. Fella's smile blossomed, and she gave a small laugh. We could have a look around, I suppose. Ambrose scowled in her direction. She made a placating gesture towards him. Everyone knows he's in the Arcanum, Ambrose, she said. What's the harm of just letting him in? Ambrose glared at her. Why don't you run along to Tomes and play the good little fetch and carry girl? He said coldly. I can handle things out here by myself. Moving stiffly, Faire got up from her desk, gathered up the book she'd been trying to read, and headed into Tomes. As she pulled the door open, I like to think she gave me a brief look of gratitude and relief, but perhaps it was only my imagination. As the door swung shut behind her, the room seemed to grow a little dimmer. I'm not speaking poetically. The light truly seemed to dim. I looked at the sympathy lamps hanging around the room, wondering what was wrong. But a moment later, I felt a slow, burning sensation begin to creep across my back and realized the truth. The null root was wearing off. Most powerful painkillers have serious side effects. Tennyson occasionally produces delirium or fainting. Lucilium is poisonous. Ophalum is highly addictive. Menka is perhaps the most powerful of all, but there are reasons they call it devil root. Null root was less powerful than these, but much safer. It was a mild anesthetic, stimulant, and a vascular constrictor, which is why I hadn't bled like a stuck pig when they'd whipped me. Best of all, it had no major side effects. Still, there was always a price to be paid. Once null root wears off, it leaves you physically and mentally exhausted. Regardless, I had come here to see the stacks. I was now a member of the Arcanum, and I didn't intend to leave until I'd been inside the archives. I turned back to the desk, my expression resolute. Ambrose gave me a long, calculating look before heaving a sigh. Fine, he said. How about a deal? You keep quiet about what you saw here today, and I'll bend the rules and let you in even though you aren't officially in the book. He looked a little nervous. How does that sound? Even as he spoke, I could feel the stimulant effect from the null root fading. My body felt heavy and tired. My thoughts grew sluggish and syrupy. I reached up to rub at my face with my hands and winced as the motion tugged sharply at the stitches all across my back. That'll be fine, I said thickly. Ambrose opened up one of the ledger books and sighed as he turned the pages. This is your first time in the archives proper. You'll have to pay the stack fee. My mouth tasted strangely of lemons. That was a side effect Ben had never mentioned. It was distracting, and after a moment I saw that Ambrose was looking up at me expectantly. What? He gave me a strange look. The stack fee. There wasn't any fee before, I said. When I was in the Tomes. Ambrose looked up at me as if I were an idiot. That's because it's the stack fee. He looked back down at the ledger. Normally, you pay it in addition to your first term's Arcanum tuition, but since you've jumped rank on us, you'll need to tend to it now. How much is it? I asked, feeling for my purse. 1 talent, he said, and you do have to pay before you can go in. Rules are rules. After paying for my bunk and news, a talent was nearly all my remaining money. I was keenly aware of the fact that I needed to hoard my resources to save for next term's tuition. As soon as I couldn't pay, I would have to leave the university. Still, it was a small price to pay for something I'd dreamed about for most of my life. I pulled a talent out of my purse and handed it over. Do I need to sign in? Nothing so formal as that, Ambrose said as he opened a drawer and pulled out a small metal disc. Stupefied from the side effects of the null root, it took me a moment to recognize it for what it was, a handheld sympathy lamp. The stacks aren't lit, Ambrose said matter-of-factly. There's too much space in there, and it would be bad for the books in the long term. Hand lamps cost 1.5 talents. I hesitated. Ambrose nodded to himself and looked thoughtful.
A lot of folk end up strapped during first term.
He reached down into a lower drawer and rooted around for a long moment.
Hand lamps are a talent and a half, and there's nothing I can do about that.
He brought out a 4-inch taper.
But candles are just a halfpenny.
Halfpenny for a candle was a remarkably good deal. I brought out a penny. I'll take 2.
This is our last one,
Ambrose said quickly. He looked around nervously before pushing it into my hand.
Tell you what, you could have it for free.
He smiled.
Just don't tell anyone. It'll be our little secret.
I took the candle, more than a little surprised. Apparently, I'd frightened him with my idle threat earlier. Either that, or this rude, pompous noble's son wasn't half the bastard I'd taken.
How wrong are you?
Ambrose hurried me into the stacks as quickly as possible, leaving me no time to light my candle. When the doors swung shut behind me, it was as black as the inside of a sack, with only a faint hint of reddish sympathy light coming around the edges of the door behind me. As I didn't have any matches with me, I had to resort to sympathy. Ordinarily, I could have done it quick as blinking, but my Nalrud weary mind could barely muster the necessary concentration. I gritted my teeth, fixed the Allah in my mind, and after a few seconds, I felt the cold leach into my muscles as I drew enough heat from my own body to bring the wick of the candle sputtering to life. Books. With no windows to let in the sunlight, the stacks were utterly dark except for the gentle light of my candle. Stretching away into the darkness were shelf on shelf of books. More books than I could look at if I took a whole day. More books than I could read in a lifetime. The air was cool and dry. It smelled of old leather, parchment, and forgotten secrets. I wondered idly how they kept the air so fresh in a building with no windows. Cupping a hand in front of my candle, I made my flickering way through the shelves, savoring the moment, soaking everything in. Shadows danced wildly back and forth across the ceiling as my candle's flame moved from side to side. The Nalrud had worn off completely by this point. My back was throbbing and my thoughts were leaden, as if I had a high fever or had taken a hard blow to the back of the head. I knew I wasn't going to be up for a long bout of reading, but I still couldn't bring myself to read so soon. Not after everything I'd gone through to get it. I wandered aimlessly for perhaps a quarter of an hour, exploring. I discovered several small stone rooms with heavy wooden doors and tables inside. They were obviously meant as a place where small groups could meet and talk without disturbing the perfect quiet of the archives. I found stairwells leading down as well as up. The archives was 6 stories tall, but I hadn't known it extended underground as well. How deep did it go? How many tens of thousands of books were waiting under my feet? I can hardly describe how comforting it was in the cool, quiet dark. I was perfectly content, lost among the endless books. It made me feel safe, knowing that the answers to all my questions were here, somewhere, waiting. It was quite by accident that I found the 4-plate door. It was made of a solid piece of grey stone, the same colour as the surrounding walls. Its frame was 8 inches wide, also grey, and also one single seamless piece of stone.
Charge
The door
complete.
and frame fit together so tightly that a pin couldn't slide into the crack. It had no hinges, no handle, no window or sliding panel. Its only features were 4 hard copper plates. They were set flush with the face of the door, which was flush with the front of the frame, which was flush with the wall surrounding it. You could run your hand from one side of the door to the next and hardly feel the lines of it at all. In spite of these notable lacks, the expanse of grey stone was undoubtedly a door. It simply was. Each copper plate had a hole in its center, and though they were not shaped in the conventional way, they were undoubtedly keyholes. The door sat still as a mountain, quiet and indifferent as the sea on a windless day. This was not a door for opening, it was a door for staying closed. In its center, between the untarnished copper plates, a word was chiseled deep into the stone. Valentins. There were other locked doors in the university, places where dangerous things were kept, where old and forgotten secrets slept, silent and hidden. Doors whose opening was forbidden, doors whose thresholds no one crossed, whose keys had been destroyed or lost or locked away themselves for safety's sake. But they all paled in comparison to the 4-plate door. I lay my palm on the cool, smooth face of the door and pushed, hoping against hope that it might swing open to my touch. But it was solid and unmoving as a greystone. I tried to peer through the holes in the copper plates, but couldn't see anything by the
Let's
light.
do this later.
I wanted to get inside so badly I could taste it. Probably shows a perverse element of my personality that even though I was finally inside the archives, surrounded by endless secrets, that I was drawn to the one locked door I had found. Perhaps it is human nature to seek out hidden things. Perhaps it is simply my nature. Just then, I saw the red, unwavering light of a sympathy lamp approaching through the shelves. It was the first sign I'd seen of any other students in the archives. I took a step back and waited, thinking to ask whoever was coming what was behind the door, what Valentins meant. The red light swelled, and I saw 2 scrivs turn a corner. They paused, and one of them bolted to where I stood and snatched my candle away, spilling hot wax on my hand in the process of extinguishing it. His expression couldn't have been more horrified if he had found me carrying a freshly severed head. "What are you doing with an open flame in here?" he demanded in the loudest whisper I had ever heard. He lowered his voice and waved the now extinguished candle at me. "Sharp body of God! What's the matter with you?" I rubbed at the hot wax on the back of my hand, trying to think clearly through the fog of pain and exhaustion. Of course, I thought, remembering Ambrose's smile as he pressed the candle into my hands and hurried me through the door. Our little secret. Of course I should have known. One of the scrivs led me out of the stacks while the other ran to fetch Master Lauren. When we emerged into the entryway, Ambrose managed to look confused and shocked. He overacted the part, but it was convincing enough for the scriv accompanying me. "What's he doing in here?" "We found him wandering around," the scriv explained, "with a candle." "What?" Ambrose's expression was perfectly aghast. "Well, I didn't sign him in," Ambrose said. He flipped open one of the ledger books. "Look, see for yourself." Before anything else could be said, Lauren stormed into the room. His normally placid expression was fierce and hard. I felt myself sweat cold, and I thought of what Tekam wrote in his Theophany. There are 3 things all wise men fear: the sea and storm, a night with no moon, and the anger of a gentle man. Lauren towered over the entry desk. "Explain!" he demanded of the nearby scriv. His voice was a tight coil of fury. "Micah and I saw a flickering light in the stacks, and we went to see if someone was having trouble with their lamp. We found him near the southeast stairwell with this." The scriv held up the candle. His hand shook slightly under Lauren's glare. Lauren turned to the desk where Ambrose sat. "How did this happen, Rayla?" Ambrose raised his hands helplessly. "He came in earlier, and I wouldn't admit him because he wasn't in the book. We bickered for a while. Faire was here for most of it." He looked at me. "Eventually, I told him he'd have to leave. He must have snuck in when I went into the back room for ink." Ambrose shrugged. "Or maybe he slipped in past the desk in Toons." I stood there, stupefied. What little part of my mind wasn't leaden with fatigue was preoccupied with the screaming pain across my back. That's not true!" I looked up at Lauren. "He let me in. He sent Faire away, then let me in." "What?" Ambrose gaped at me, momentarily speechless. For all that I didn't like him, I must give him credit for a masterful performance. Why in God's name would I do that? Because I embarrassed you in front of Faire, I said. He sold me the candle, too. I shook my head, trying to clear my head. No, he gave it to me. Ambrose's expression was amazed.
Look at him!
He laughed.
The little cocker is drunk or something.
I was just whipped, I protested. My voice sounded shrill in my own ears.
Enough!
Lauren shouted, looming over us like a pillar of anger. The scribs went pale at the sound of him. Lauren turned away from me and made a brief contemptuous gesture towards the desk.
Lord Ambrose is officially remanded for laxity in his duty. What?
Ambrose's indignant tone wasn't feigned this time. Lauren frowned at him, and Ambrose closed his mouth. Turning to me, he said,
Earlier Quoth is banned from the archives.
He made a sweeping gesture with the flat of his hand. I tried to think of something I could say in my defense. Master, I didn't mean... Lauren rounded on me. His expression, always so calm before, was filled with such cold, terrible anger that I took a step away from him without meaning to.
You mean?
He said.
I care nothing for your intentions, Elia Quoth. Deceived or otherwise, all that matters is the reality of your actions. Your hand held the fire. Yours is the blame. That is the lesson all adults must learn.
I looked down at my feet, tried desperately to think of something I could say, some proof I could offer. My leaden thoughts were still plodding along when Lauren strode out of the room.
I don't see why I should be punished for his stupidity.
Ambrose groused to the other scribs as I made my way numbly to the door. I made the mistake of turning around and looking at him. His expression was serious, carefully controlled, but his eyes were vastly amused, full of laughter.
Honestly, boy,
he said to me,
I don't know what you were thinking. You think a member of the Arcanum would have more sense.
Oh, Chinka, no!
I made my way to the mess, the wheels of my thoughts turning slowly as I plodded along. I fumbled my meal chit into one of the dull tin trays and collected a portion of steamed pudding, a sausage, and some of the ever-present beans. I looked dully around the room until I spotted Simon and Manet sitting in their usual place at the northeast corner of the hall. I drew a fair amount of attention as I walked to the table. Understandable, as it was scarcely 2 hours since I'd been tied to the pennant pole and publicly lashed. I heard someone whisper, "Didn't bleed when they whipped him. I was there, not one drop." It was the Nalru, of course. It had kept me from bleeding. It had seemed like such a good idea at the time. Now it seemed petty and foolish. Ambrose would never have managed to gull me so easily if my naturally suspicious nature hadn't been fuddled. I'm sure I could have found some way to explain things to Lauren if I'd had my wits about me. As I made my way to the far corner of the room, I realized the truth. I had traded away my access to the archives in exchange for a little notoriety. Still, there was nothing to do but make the best of it. If a bit of reputation was all I had to show for this debacle, I'd have to do my best to build on it. I kept my shoulders straight as I made my way across the room to Simon and Manet and set down my food. "There's no such thing as a stack fee, is there?" I asked quietly as I slid into my seat, trying not to grimace at the pain across my back. Sim looked at me blankly. "Stack fee?" Manet chortled into his bowl of beans. "It's been a few years since I heard that. Back when I worked as a scriv, we tricked the first termers into giving us a penny to use the archives. Called it a stack fee." Sim gave him a disapproving look. "That's horrible." Manet held up his hands defensively in front of his face. "Just a little harmless fun." Manet looked me over. "Is that what your long face is for? Somebody call you for a copper?" I shook my head. I wasn't going to announce that Ambrose had tricked me out of a whole talent. "Guess who just got banned from the archives?" I said gravely, as I tore the crust off my bread and dropped it into my beans. They looked at me blankly. After a moment, Simon took the obvious guess. You? I nodded and began to spoon up my beans. I wasn't really hungry, but I hoped a little food in my stomach might help shake off the sluggishness of the null root. Besides, it went against my nature to pass up an opportunity for a meal. You got suspended on your first day, Simon said. That's going to make studying your Chandrian folklore a whole lot harder. I sighed. You could say that. How long did he suspend you for? He said banned, I answered. He didn't mention a time limit. Banned? Manet looked up at me. He hasn't banned anyone in a dozen years. What do? Piss in a book? Some of the scribs found me inside with a candle. Merciful Sailor! Manet laid down his fork, his expression serious for the first time. Oh, Law must have been furious. Furious is exactly the right word, I said. What possessed you to go in there with an open flame? Simon asked. I couldn't afford a hand lamp, I said. So the scriv at the desk gave me a candle instead. He didn't, Sim said. No scriv would. Hold on, Manet said. Was this a dark-haired fellow, well-dressed, severe eyebrows? He made an exaggerated scowl. I nodded tiredly. Ambrose. We met yesterday, got off on the wrong foot. He's hard to avoid, Manet said carefully with a significant look to the people sitting around us. I noticed that more than a few were casually listening to our conversation. Someone should have warned you to keep clear of him, he added in a softer tone. God's mother, Simon said. Of all the people who don't want to start a pissing contest. Well, it's been started, I said. I was starting to feel a little more like myself again, less cotton-headed and weary. Either the side effects of the null root were fading or my anger was slowly burning away the haze of exhaustion. He'll find out I can piss along with the best of them. He'll wish he'd never met me, let alone meddled with my affairs. Simon looked a little nervous. You really shouldn't threaten other students, he said with a little laugh, as if trying to pass my comment off as a joke. More softly, he said, You don't understand. Ambrose is heir to a barony off in Winters. He hesitated, looking to Manet. Lord, how do I even start? Manet leaned forward and spoke in more confidential tones as well. He's not one of those nobility who dabble here for a term or two then leave. He's been here for years, climbed his way up to Raylock. He's not some seventh son either. He's the firstborn heir, and his father is one of the 12 most powerful men in all of Ventures. Actually, he's 16th in the peerage, Sim said matter-of-factly. You've got the royal family, Prince Regents, Mayor Alvaron, Duchess Solista, Aculeus, and Meluan Lactans. He trailed off under Manet's glare. He has money, Manet said simply, and the friends that money buys. And people who want to curry favour with his father, Simon added. The point is, Manet said seriously, you don't want to cross him. Back in his first year here, one of the alchemists got on Ambrose's bad side. Ambrose bought his debt from the moneylender in England. When the fellow couldn't pay, they clapped him into debtor's prison. Manet tore a piece of bread in half and daubed butter onto it. By the time his family got him out, he had lung consumption. The fellow was a wreck. Never came back to his studies. And the masters just let this happen? I demanded. All perfectly legal, Manet said, still keeping his voice low. Even so, Ambrose wasn't so silly that he bought the fellow's debt himself. Manet made a dismissive gesture. He had someone else do that, but he made sure everyone knew he was responsible. And there was Tabitha, Sim said darkly. She made all that noise about how Ambrose had promised to marry her. She just disappeared. This certainly explained why Faire had been so hesitant to offend her. I made a placating gesture to Sim. I'm not threatening anyone, I said innocently, pitching my voice so anyone who was listening could easily hear. I'm just quoting one of my favourite pieces of literature. It's from the 4th act of Dionica, where Tarsus says, "Upon him I will visit famine and a fire, till all around him desolation rings, and all the demons in the outer dark look on amazed, and recognize that vengeance is the business of a man." There was a moment of stunned silence nearby. It spread a bit farther through the mess than I'd expected. Apparently, I'd underestimated the number of people who were listening. I turned my attention back to my meal and decided to let it go for now. I was tired, and I hurt, and I didn't particularly want any more trouble today.
"You won't need this piece of information for a while,"
Manet said quietly after a long period of silence.
"What with being banned from the archives and all. Still, I'm supposing you'd rather know."
He cleared his throat uncomfortably.
"You don't have to buy a hand lamp. You just sign them out at the desk and return them when you're done."
He looked at me as if anxious about what sort of reaction the information might provoke. I nodded wearily. I'd been right before. Ambrose wasn't half the bastard I thought he was.
It's double
He
the
was 10
bastard.
times the
Okay.
bastard. Chapter 44. The Burning Glass. The fishery was where most of the university's works of hands were made. The building held shops for glassblowers, joiners, potters and glaziers. There was also a full forge and smelt works that would figure prominently in any metallurgist's daydreams. Kilvin's workshop was located in the artificery, or as it was more commonly called, the fishery. It was big as the inside of a granary, holding at least 24 thick timbered work tables strewn with countless nameless tools and projects in progress. The workshop was the heart of the fishery, and Kilvin was the heart of the workshop. When I arrived, Kilvin was in the process of bending a twisted length of iron rod into what I could only assume was a more desirable shape. Seeing me peering in, he left it firmly clamped to the table and walked to meet me, wiping his hands on his shirt. He looked me over critically.
"Are you well, Elliot quoth?"
I'd gone wandering earlier and found some willow bark to chew. My back still burned and itched, but it was bearable. "Well enough, Master Kilvin?" He nodded.
"Good. Boys your age shouldn't worry over such small things. Soon again you will be as sound as stone."
I was trying to think up a polite response when my eye was drawn to something over our heads. Kilvin followed my gaze up over his shoulder. When he saw what I was looking at, a grin split his great bearded face.
"Ah!"
he said with fatherly pride.
"My lovelies!"
High among the high rafters of the workshop, 100 glass spheres hung from chains. They were of varying sizes, though none were much larger than a man's head, and they were burning. Seeing my expression, Kilvin made a gesture.
"Come,"
he said, and led me to a narrow stairway made of wrought iron. Reaching the top, we stepped out onto a series of slim iron walkways 25 feet above the ground, weaving their way among the thick timbers that supported the roof. After a moment of maneuvering through the maze of timber and iron, we came to the hanging row of glass spheres with fires burning inside them.
"These,"
Kilvin gestured,
"are my lamps."
It was only then that I realized what they were. Some were filled with liquid and wicking, much like ordinary lamps, but most of them were utterly unfamiliar. One contained nothing but a boiling grey smoke that flickered sporadically. Another sphere contained a wick hanging in empty air from a silver wire, burning with a motionless white flame, despite its apparent lack of fuel. Two hanging side by side were twins, save that one had a blue flame and the other was a hot forge orange. Some were small as plums, others as large as melons. One held what looked like a piece of black coal and a piece of white chalk, and where the two pieces were pressed together, an angry red flame burned outward in all directions. Kilvin let me look for a long while, before he moved closer.
Among the Kildar, there are legends of ever-burning lamps. I believe that such a thing was once within the scope of our craft. 10 years I have been looking. I have made many lamps, some of them very good, very long burning.
He looked
Running.
at me.
But none of them ever burning.
He walked down the line to point at one of the hanging spheres.
You know this one, Elier Kvor?
It held nothing but a knob of greenish-greyish wax that was burning with a greenish-greyish tongue of flame. I shook my head.
You should. White lithium salt. I thought of it 3 span before you came to us. It is good so far, 24 days, and I expect many more.
He looked at me.
You're guessing this thing surprised me, as it took me 10 years to think of it. Your second guess, sodium oil, was not as good. I tried it years ago. 11 days.
He moved all the way to the end of the row, pointing at the empty sphere with the motionless white flame.
70 days, he said proudly. I do not hope that this will be the one, for hoping is a foolish game. But if it burns 6 more days, it will be my best lamp in these 10 years.
He watched it for a while, his expression oddly soft.
But I do not hope,
he said resolutely.
I make new lamps and take my measurements. That is the only way to make progress.
Wordlessly, he led me back down to the floor of the workshop. Once there, he turned to me.
Hands,
he said in a peremptory way. He held out his own huge hands expectantly. Not knowing what he wanted, I raised my hands in front of me. He took them in his own, his touch surprisingly gentle. He turned them over, looking at them carefully.
You have Kildar hands,
he said in a grudging compliment. He held his own up for me to see. They were thick-fingered with wide palms. He made 2 fists that looked more like mauls than bald hands.
I had many years before these hands could learn to be Kildar hands. You are lucky. You will work here.
Only by the quizzical tilting of his head did he make the gruff grumble of a statement into an invitation. Oh, yes. I mean, thank you, sir. I'm honored that you... He cut me off with an impatient gesture.
Come to me if you have any thoughts on the ever-burning lamp. If your head is as clever as your hands look.
What might have been a smile was hidden by his thick beard, but a grin shone in his dark eyes as he hesitated teasingly, almost playfully.
If,
he repeated, holding up a finger, its tip as large as the ball of a hammer's head.
Then me and mine will show you things.
No, I can't interrupt this.
You need to figure out who you're going to suck up to, Simon said. A master has to sponsor you to Raylar, so you should pick one and stick to him like shit on his shoe. Lovely, Sovoy said dryly. Sovoy, Willem, Simon and I were sitting at an out-of-the-way table in the back of Ankle, isolated from the felling night crowd that filled the room with a low roar of conversation. My stitches had come out 2 days earlier, and we were celebrating my first full span in the Arcanum. We were none of us particularly drunk, but then again, none of us were particularly sober either. Our exact positioning between those 2 points is a matter of pointless conjecture, and I will waste no time on it. I simply concentrate on being brilliant, Sovoy said. Then wait for the masters to realize it. How did that work out with Mandrag? Willem said with a rare smile. Sovoy gave Willem a dark look. Mandrag is a horse's arse. That explains why you threatened him with your riding crop, Willem said. I covered my mouth to stifle a laugh. Did you really? They're not telling the whole story, Sovoy said affronted. He passed me over for promotion in favor of another student. He was keeping me back so he could use me as indentured labor rather than raise me to Raylar. And you threatened him with your crop. We had an argument, Sovoy said calmly, and I happened to have my crop in my hand. You waved it at them, Willem said. I'd been riding, Savoy said hotly. If I'd been whoring before class and waved a corset at him, no one would have thought twice about it. There was a moment of silence at our table. I'm thinking twice about it right now, Simon said before bursting into laughter with Willem. Savoy fought down a smile as he turned to face me. Sim is right about one thing. You should concentrate your efforts on one subject, otherwise you'll end up like Manet, the eternal Elir. He stood and straightened his clothes. Now, how do I look? Savoy wasn't fashionably dressed in the strictest sense, as he clung to the Madigan styles rather than the local ones.
How many patrols
But
starting
there was no
here?
denying that he cut quite a figure in the muted colours of his fine silks and suedes. What does it matter? Willem asked. Are you trying to set up a tryst with Sim? Savoy smiled. Unfortunately, I must leave you. I have an engagement with a lady, and I doubt our rounds will bring us to this side of town tonight. You didn't tell us you had a date, Sim protested. We can't play corners with just 3. It
Another
was
one.
something of a concession that Savoy was here with us at all. He'd sniffed a bit at Will and Sim's choice of taverns. Anchor's was low class enough so that the drinks were cheap, but high class enough so that you didn't have to worry about someone picking a fight or throwing up on you. I liked it. You are good friends and good company, Savoy said, but none of you are female, nor, with the possible exception of Simon, are you lovely. Savoy winked at him. Honestly, who among you wouldn't throw the others over if there was a lady waiting? We murmured a grudging agreement. Savoy smiled. His teeth were very white and straight. I'll send the girl over with more drinks, he said as he turned to go, to ease the bitter sting of my departure. He's not a bad sort, I mused after he left. For nobility. Willem nodded. It's like he knows he's better than you but doesn't look down on you for it because he knows it's not your fault. So, who are you going to cozy up to? Sim asked, resting his elbows on the table. I'm guessing not Heme. Or Lauren, I said bitterly. Damn Ambrose, 12 ways. I would have loved to work in the archives. Brandia's out too, Sim said. If Heme has a grudge, Brandia helps him carry it. What about the Chancellor? Willem asked. Linguistics. You already speak Sharu, even if your accent is barbaric. I shook my head. What about Mandrag? I've got a lot of experience with chemistry. It'd be a small step into alchemy. Simon laughed. Everyone thinks chemistry and alchemy are so similar, but they're really not. They're not even related. They just happen to live in the same house. Willem gave a slow nod. That's a nice way of putting it. Besides, Simon said, Mandrag brought in about 20 new Elia last term. I heard him complaining about how crowded things were. You've got a long haul if you go through Medica, Willem said. Arwell is stubborn as pig iron. There is no bending him. He made a gesture with his hand as if chopping something into sections while he spoke. 6 terms, Elia. 8 terms Raylar. 10 terms Elphic. At least, Simon added, Molar's been a Raylar with him for almost 3 years now. I tried to think of how I could come up with 6 years' worth of tuition. I might not have the patience for that, I said. The serving girl appeared with a tray of drinks. Anchor's was only half full, so she'd been running, just enough to bring roses to her cheeks. Your gentleman friend paid for this round and the next, she said. I like Savoy more and more, Willem said. However, she held Will's drink out of his reach. He didn't pay for putting his hand on my arse. She looked each of us in the eye. I'll trust the 3 of you to settle that debt before you leave. Sim stammered an apology.
Clever mermaid.
He doesn't mean... In his culture, that sort of thing is more common. She rolled her eyes, her expression softening. Well, in this culture, a healthy tip makes a fine apology. She handed Will his drink and turned to leave, resting her empty tray on one hip. We watched her go, each of us thinking our own private thoughts. I noticed he had his rings back, I mentioned eventually. He played a brilliant round of Basset last night, Simon said. Made 6 doublings in a row and cracked the bank. to Savoy. Willem held up his tin mug. May his luck keep him in classes and us in drinks. We toasted and drank. Then Willem brought us back to the matter at hand. That leaves you with Kelvin and Elk Sadat. He held up 2 fingers. What about Elodine? I interrupted. They both gave me blank looks. What about him? Simon asked. He seems nice enough, I said. Couldn't I study under him? Simon burst out laughing. Willem gave a rare grin. What? I demanded. Elodine doesn't teach anything, Sim explained, except maybe advanced oddness. He has to teach something, I protested. He's a master, isn't he? Sim is right. Elodine is cramped. Will tapped the side of his head. Cracked, Simon corrected. Cracked, Will repeated. He does seem a little strange, I said. You do pick things up quick, Willem said dryly. No wonder you made it into the Arcanum at such a tender age. Ease off, Will. He's hardly been here a span. Simon turned to me. Elodine used to be Chancellor about 5 years ago. Elodine? I couldn't hide my incredulity. But he's so young and... I trailed off, not wanting to say the first word that came to my mind. Crazy. Simon finished my sentence. Brilliant. And not that young if you consider that he was admitted to the university when he was barely 14. Simon looked at me. He was a full arcanist by 18. Then he stayed around as a giller for a few years. Giller? I interrupted. Gillers are arcanists who stay at the university, Will said. They do a lot of the teaching. You know Kamar in the fishery? I shook my head. Tall, scarred. Will gestured to one side of his face. Only one eye? I nodded somberly. Kamar was hard to miss. The left side of his face was a web of scars that radiated out, leaving bald strips running through his black hair and beard. He wore a patch over the hollow of his left eye. He was a walking object lesson about how dangerous work in the fishery could be. I've seen him around. He's a full arcanist. Will nodded. He's Kelvin's second in command. He teaches sigildry to the newer students. Sim cleared his throat. As I was saying, Elodine was the youngest ever admitted, youngest to make arcanist, and youngest to be chancellor. Even so, I said, you have to admit he's a little odd to be chancellor. Not back then, Simon said soberly. That was before
Do they turn?
When nothing more was forthcoming, I prompted. It? Will shrugged. Something. They do not speak on it. They locked him in the crockery until he got most of his marbles back. I don't like thinking about it, Simon said, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. I mean, a couple of students go crazy every term, right? He looked at Willem. Remember Slith? Will nodded somberly. It might happen to any of us. There was a moment of silence as the two of them sipped their drinks, not looking at anything in particular. I wanted to ask for specifics, but I could tell that it was a touchy subject. Anyway, Sim said in a low voice, I heard they didn't let him out of the crockery. I heard he escaped. No arcanist worth his salt can be kept in a cell, I said. That's not surprising. Have you ever been there? Simon asked. It's built to keep arcanists locked up, all meshed stone, wards on the doors and windows. He shook his head. I can't imagine how someone could get out, even one of the masters. All this is beside the path, Willem said firmly, bringing us back to task. Kelvin has welcomed you to the fishery. Impressing him will be your best chance at making Raylar. He looked back and forth between us. Agreed. Agreed, Simon said. I nodded, but the wheels in my head were spinning. I was thinking about Tabor the Great, who knew the names of all things. I thought about the stories Scarby had told back in Tarbine. He hadn't mentioned arcanists, only maidens. And I thought of Elodine, Master Namer, and how I might approach him.
Elodie.
Chapter 45. Interlude. Some tavern tale. At a gesture from Quoth, Chronicler wiped off the nib of his pen and shook out his hand. Bast gave a great seated stretch, his arms arching over the back of the chair. I had almost forgotten how quickly it all happened, Quoth mused. Those were probably the first stories anyone ever told about me. They're still telling them at the university, Chronicler said. I've heard 3 different versions of the class you taught. Your whipping, too. Is that when they started calling you Quoth the Bloodless? Quoth nodded. Possibly. If we're asking questions, Reshi, Bast said sheepishly, I was wondering why you didn't go looking for Scarpy. What could I have done, Bast? Smeared my face with lampblack and staged a daring midnight rescue? Quoth gave a brief, humorless laugh. They'd taken him in on heresy. All I could do was hope he truly had friends in the church. Quoth drew a deep breath and sighed. But the simplest reason is the least satisfying one, I suppose. The truth is this. I wasn't living in a story. I don't think I'm understanding you, Reshi, Bast said, puzzled. Think of all the stories you've heard, Bast. You have a young boy, the hero. His parents are killed. He sets out for vengeance. What happens next? Bast hesitated, his expression puzzled. Chronicler answered the question instead. He finds help. A clever talking squirrel, an old drunken swordsman, a mad hermit in the woods, that sort of thing. Quoth nodded. Exactly. He finds the mad hermit in the woods, proves himself worthy, and learns the names of all things, just like Tarbolin the Great. Then, with these powerful magics at his beck and call, what does he do? Chronicler shrugged. He finds the villains and kills them. Of course, Quoth said grandly. Clean, quick, and easy as lying. We know how it ends, practically, before it starts. That's why stories appeal to us. They give us the clarity and simplicity our real lives lack. Quoth leaned forward.
A real good
This were
story
some
don't.
tale, all half-truth and senseless adventure. I would tell you how my time at the university was spent with a purity of dedication. I would learn the ever-changing name of the wind, ride out and gain my revenge against the champion. Quoth snapped his fingers sharply. Simple as that. But while this might make for an entertaining story, it would not be the truth. The truth is this. I had mourned my parents' death for 3 years, and the pain of it had faded to a dull ache. Quoth made a conciliatory gesture with one hand and smiled a tight smile. I won't lie to you. There were times late at night when I lay sleepless and desperately alone in my narrow bunk in the mews. Times when I was choked with a sorrow so endless and empty that I thought it would smother me. There were times when I would see a mother holding her child or a father laughing with his son, and anger would flare up in me, hot and furious with the memory of blood and the smell of burning hair. Quoth shrugged. But there was more to my life than revenge. I had very real obstacles to overcome close at hand. My poverty, my low birth. The enemies I made at the university were more dangerous to me than any of the Chandrian. He gestured for Chronicler to pick up his pen. But for all that, we still see that even the most fanciful of stories hold a shred of truth. Because I did find something very near to the mad hermit in the woods. Quoth smiled. And I was determined to learn the name of the wind. Chapter 46. The Ever-Changing Wind. Elodine proved a difficult man to find. He had an office in Hollows, but never seemed to use it. When I visited ledgers and lists, I discovered he only taught one class, unlikely maths. However, this was less than helpful in tracking him down, as according to the ledger, the time of the class was now and the location was everywhere. In the end, I spotted him through sheer luck across a crowded courtyard. He was wearing his black master's robes, which was something of a rarity. I was on my way to the Medica for observation, but decided I'd rather be late for my class than miss the opportunity to speak. By the time I struggled through the midday crowd and caught up with him, we were on the northern edge of the university, following a wide dirt road that led into the forest. Master Elodine, I said, pelting up to him. I was hoping I could talk with you. A sad little hope, he said without breaking stride or looking in my direction. You should aim higher. A young man ought to be a fire with high ambitions. I hope to study naming, then, I said, falling into step beside him. Too high, he said matter-of-factly. Try again, somewhere in between. The dirt road curved and trees blocked the sight of the university's buildings behind us. I hope you'll accept me as a student, I tried again, and teach me whatever you think best. Elodine stopped walking abruptly and turned to face me. Fine, he said. Go find me 3 pine cones. He made a circle with his thumb and finger, this big, without any of the little bits broken off. He sat down right in the middle of the road and made a shooing motion with his hand. Go on, hurry. I darted off into the surrounding trees. It took me about 5 minutes to find 3 pine cones of the appropriate type. By the time I got back to the road, I was disheveled and bramble-scratched. Elodine was nowhere to be seen. I looked around stupidly, then cursed, dropped the pine cones, and took off, following the road north. I caught up with him very quickly, as he was just idling along looking at the trees. So what did you learn? Elodine asked. That you want to be left alone? You are quick. He spread his arms dramatically and intoned. Here endeth the lesson. Here endeth my profound tutelage of Elia Quoth. I sighed. If I left now, I could still catch my class in the Medica. But part of me suspected that this might be a test of some sort. Perhaps Elodine was simply making sure that I was genuinely interested before he accepted me as a student. That is the way it usually goes in stories. A young man has to prove his dedication to the old hermit in the woods before he's taken under his wing. Will you answer a few questions? I asked. Fine, he said, holding up his hand with his thumb and forefinger curled in. 3 questions. If you agree to leave me be afterwards. I thought for a moment. Why don't you want to teach me? Because the Ademaru make exceptionally poor students, he said brusquely. They are fine for rote learning, but the study of naming requires a level of dedication that rebels such as yourself rarely possess. My temper flared so hot and quick that I actually felt my skin burn. It started at my face and burned down my chest and arms. It made the hair on my arms prickle. I took a deep breath. I'm sorry that your experience with the Rue has left something to be desired, I said carefully. Let me assure you that... ye gods, Elodine sighed, disgusted. A bootlicker too. You lack the requisite spine and testicular fortitude to study under me. Hot words boiled up inside me. I fought them down. He was trying to bait me. You aren't telling me the truth, I said. Why don't you want to teach me? For the same reason I don't want a puppy, Elodine shouted, waving his arms in the air like a farmer trying to startle crows out of a field. Because you're too short to be a namer. Your eyes are too green. You have the wrong number of fingers. Come back when you're taller and you've found a decent pair of eyes. We stared at each other for a long while. Finally, he shrugged and started walking again. Fine. I'll show you why. We followed the road north. Elodine strolled along, picking up stones and tossing them into the trees. He jumped to snatch leaves from low-hanging branches, his master's robes billowing ridiculously. At one point, he stopped and stood motionless and intent for nearly half an hour, staring at a fern swaying slowly in the wind. But I kept the tip of my tongue firmly between my teeth. I didn't ask, where are we going, or what are you looking at? I knew 100 stories about young boys who squandered questions or wishes by chatting them away. I had 2 questions left, and I was going to make them count. Eventually, we emerged from the forest, and the road became a path leading up a vast lawn to a huge manor house. Bigger than the artificery, it had elegant lines, a red tile roof, high windows, arched doorways and pillars. There were fountains, flowers, hedges. But something wasn't quite right. The closer we got to the gates, the more I doubted this was some nobleman's estate. Maybe it was something about the design of the gardens, or the fact that the wrought iron fence surrounding the lawns was nearly 10 feet tall and unclimbable to my well-trained thief's eye. 2 serious-eyed men opened the gate, and we continued up the path toward the front doors. Elodine looked at me. "Have you heard of Haven yet?" I shook my head. "It has other names. The Rookery, the Crockery, the University Asylum." "It's huge. How—" I stopped before asking the question. Elodin grinned, knowing he'd almost caught me. "Jeremy," he called out to the large man who stood at the front door. "How many guests do we have today?" "The desk could give you a count, sir," he said uncomfortably. "Take a wild guess," Elodin said. "We're all friends here." 320, the man said with a shrug. 350. Elodin rapped on the thick timber door with a knuckle, and the man scrambled to unlock it. "How many more could we fit in if we needed?" Elodin asked him. "Another 150 easy," Jeremy said, tugging the huge door open. "More in a pinch, I suppose." "See, quoth," Elodin winked at me. "We're ready." The entryway was huge, with stained glass windows and vaulted ceilings. The floor was marble polished to a mirror sheen. The place was eerily silent. I couldn't understand it. The Refview Asylum in Tarbeen was only a fraction the size of this place, and it sounded like a brothel full of angry cats. You could hear it from a mile away over the din of the city. Elodine strolled up to a large desk where a young woman stood. "Why isn't anyone outside, Emmy?" She gave him an uneasy smile. "It's too wild today, sir. We think there's a storm coming in." She pulled a ledger book off the shelf. "The moon's getting full, too. You know how it gets." "Sure do." Elodin crouched down and began to unlace his shoes. "Where did they stash when this time?" She flipped a few pages in the ledger. "Second floor east, 247. Elodin stood back up and set his shoes on the desk. "Keep an eye on these, would you?" She gave him an uncertain smile and nodded. I choked down another mouthful of questions. "It seems like the university goes to an awful lot of expense here," I commented. Elodin ignored me and turned to climb a wide marble staircase in his stockings. Then we entered a long white hallway, lined with wooden doors. For the first time, I could hear the sounds I had expected in a place like this. Moans, weeping, incessant chattering, screaming, all very faint. Elodin ran for a few steps, then stopped, his stocking feet gliding across the smooth marble floor, his master's robes streaming out behind him. He repeated this, a few quick steps, then a long slide with his arms held out to the sides for balance. I continued to pace along beside him. I'd think the masters would find other more academic uses for the university's funds. Elodin didn't look at me. Step, 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 step. "You're trying to get me to answer questions you're not asking." Slide. "It's not going to work." "You're trying to trick me into asking questions," I pointed out. "It seems only fair." Step, 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 slide. "So why the hell are you bothering with me anyway?" Elodin asked. "Kelvin likes you well enough. Why not hitch your star to his wagon?" "I think you know things I can't learn anywhere else." "Things like what?" "Things I've wanted to know since I first saw someone call the wind." "Name of the wind, was it?" Elodin raised his eyebrows. Step, 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 step. "That's tricky." Slide. What makes you think I know anything about calling the wind? Process of elimination, I said. None of the other masters do that sort of thing, so it must be your bailiwick. By your logic, I should also be in charge of solinad dances, needlework, and horse thieving. We came to the end of the hall. Mid-slide, Elodin nearly bowled over a huge, broad-shouldered man carrying a hardback. Beg your pardon, sir, he said, though it obviously wasn't his fault. Timothy, Elodin pointed a long finger at him. Come with us. Elodin led the way through several shorter hallways, eventually coming to a heavy wooden door with a sliding panel at eye level. Elodin opened it and peered through. How's he been?
Quiet,
The hulking man said.
I don't think he slept much.
Elodin tried the latch, then turned to the broad-shouldered man, his face going grim. You locked him in? The man stood a full head taller than Elodin and probably weighed twice as much, but the blood drained from his face as the shoeless master glared at him.
Not me, Master Elodin, it's...
Elodin cut him off with a sharp gesture. Unlock it! Timothy fumbled with a ring of keys. Elodin continued to stare him down. Alder Wynn is not to be confined. He may come and go as he pleases. Nothing is to be put on his food unless he specifically asks for it. I am holding you responsible for this, Timothy Generoy.
Hey there.
Elodin poked him in the chest with a long finger. If I find out that Wynn has been sedated or restrained, I'll ride you naked through the streets of Imre like a little pink pony. He glared. Go. The fellow left as quickly as he could manage without actually breaking into a run. Elodin turned to me. You can come in, but don't make any noises or sudden movements. Don't talk unless he talks to you. If you do talk, keep your voice low. Understand? I nodded and he opened the door. The room wasn't what I'd expected. Tall windows let the daylight in, revealing a sizable bed and a table with chairs. The walls, ceiling, and floor were all padded with thick white cloth, muffling even the faint noises from the hallway. The blankets had been pulled off the bed, and a thin man of about 30 was bundled up in them, huddled against the wall. Elodin closed the door, and the mousy man flinched a little. Wynn, he said softly, moving closer. What happened? Alder Wynn looked up owlishly. A thin stick of a man, he was bare-chested under the blanket, his hair in wild disarray, his eyes round and wide. He spoke softly, his voice cracking a little. I was fine. I was doing fine.
King's
But
Honor.
all the people talking.
King's honor,
Dolls.
friend.
Cobblestones. I just can't be around that right now. Wynn pressed himself against the wall and the blanket fell off his bony shoulder. I was startled to see a lead gilder around his neck. This man was a full-fledged arcanist. Elodin nodded. Why are you on the floor? Wynn looked over at the bed, panic in his eyes. I'll fall, he said softly, his voice somewhere between horror and embarrassment. And there are springs and slats, nails. How are you now? Elodin asked gently. Would you like to come back with me?
No!
Wynn gave a hopeless, despairing cry, screwing his eyes
Yeah, what do
closed
you
and
want?
pulling the blanket closer around himself. His thin, reedy voice made his plea more heart-wrenching than if he'd howled it. It's fine, you can stay, Elodin said softly. I'll be back to visit.
What's up?
Wynn opened his eyes at this, looking agitated. Don't bring thunder, he said urgently. He reached one thin hand out of his blanket and clutched at Elodin's shirt. But I do need a cat whistle and blue down, and bones too. His tone was urgent. Tent bones. I'll bring them, Elodine reassured him, gesturing for me to back out of the room. I did. Elodine closed the door behind us, his expression grim. Wynne knew what he was getting into when he became my giller. He turned and began to walk down the hall.
Yo!
You don't know anything about the university, about the risks involved. You think this place is a fairyland, a playground. It's not. That's right, I snapped. It's a playground, and all the other children are jealous because I got to play, get whipped bloody, and banned from the archives, and they didn't. Elodine stopped walking and turned to look at me. Fine. Prove me wrong. Prove that you've thought this through. Why does a university with under 1,500 students need an asylum the size of the royal palace? My mind raced. Most students are from well-to-do families, I said. They've led easy lives. When forced to... Wrong, Elodine said dismissively, turning to walk down the hall. It is because of what we study, because of the way we train our minds to move. So ciphering and grammar make people crazy, I said, taking care to phrase it as a statement. Elodine stopped walking and wrenched open the nearest door. Panicked screaming burst out into the hallway. They're at me! They're at me! They're at me! They're at me! Through the open door, I could see a young man thrashing against the leather restraints that bound him to the bed at wrist, waist, neck, and ankle. Trigonometry and diagrammed logic don't do this, Elodine said, looking me in the eye. They're at me! They're at me! They're at... The screaming continued in an unbroken chant, like the endless, mindless barking of a dog at night. Me! They're at me! They're at me! They're... Elodine closed the door. Though I could still hear the screaming faintly through the thick door, the near silence was stunning. Do you know why they call this place the Rookery? Elodine asked. I shook my head. Because it's where you go if you are a raven. He smiled a wild smile. He laughed, a terrible laugh. Elodine led me through a long series of hallways to a different wing of the crockery. Finally, we turned a corner, and I saw something new. A door made entirely of copper. Elodine took a key from his pocket and unlocked it. I like to stop in when I'm back in the neighborhood, he said casually as he opened the door. Check my mail, water the plants and such. He pulled off one of his socks, tied a knot in it, and used it to wedge the door open. It's a nice place to visit, but, you know... He tugged on the door, making sure it wouldn't swing closed. Not again. The first thing I noticed about the room was something strange about the air. At first, I thought it might be soundproofed like older winds, but looking around, I saw the walls and ceilings were bare grey stone. Next, I thought the air might be stale, except when I drew a breath, I smelled lavender and fresh linen. It was almost like there was a pressure on my ears, as if I were deep underwater, except of course that I wasn't. I waved a hand in front of me, almost expecting the air to feel different, thicker. It didn't. Pretty irritating, huh? I turned around to see Elodine watching me. I'm surprised you noticed, actually. Not many do. The room was a definite step above Alder Winds. It had a 4-post bed with curtains, an overstuffed couch, an empty bookcase, and a large table with several chairs. Most notable were the huge windows looking out over the lawns and gardens. I could see a balcony outside, but there didn't seem to be any way to get to it. Watch this, Elodine said. He picked up one of the high-backed wooden chairs, lifted it with both hands, spun in a circle, and flung it hard at the window. I cringed, but instead of a terrible crash, there was just a dull splintering of wood. The chair fell to the floor in a ruined tangle of timber and upholstery. I used to do that for hours, Elodine said, drawing a deep breath and looking around the room fondly. Good times. I went to look at the windows. They were thicker than usual, but not that thick. They seemed normal except for faint reddish streaks running through them, I glanced at the window frame. It was copper too. I looked slowly around the room, eyeing its bare stone walls, feeling its strangely heavy air. I noticed the door didn't even have a handle on the inside, let alone a lock. Why would anyone go through all the trouble of making a solid copper door? I decided on my second question. How did you get out? Finally, Elodin said with a tinge of exasperation. He slouched onto the couch. You see, once upon a time, Elodin the Great found himself locked in a high tower. He gestured to the room around us. He had been stripped of his tools, his coin, key, and candle. Furthermore, his cell had no door worth mentioning, no window that could be breached. He made dismissive gestures at each of these. Even the name of the wind was hidden from him by the clever machinations of his captors. Elodin got up from the couch and began to pace the room. All around him was nothing but smooth, hard stone. It was a cell no man had ever escaped. He stopped pacing and held up a finger dramatically. But Elodin the Great knew the names of all things, and so all things were his to command. He faced the grey wall beside the windows. He said to the stone, "Break!" And Elodin trailed off, his head tilting to one side curiously, his eyes narrowed. "Shot me that changed it," he said quietly to himself. Huh. He stepped closer to the wall and lay a hand on it. I let my attention wander. Will and Sim had been right. The man was cracked in the head. What would happen if I ran out of the room, unstuck the door, and slammed it? The other masters thanked me. "Oh!" Elodin said, suddenly laughing. "That was half clever of them." He took 2 steps back from the wall. "Fier Basilian!" I saw the wall move. It rippled like a hanging rug thumped with a stick. Then it simply fell. Like dark water poured from a bucket, tons of fine grey sand spilled across the floor in a sudden rush, burying Elodin's feet up to his shins. Sunlight and birdsong poured into the room. Where there had been a foot of solid grey stone before, there was now a gaping hole big enough to drive a cart through. But the hole wasn't completely clear. Some green material was spread across the opening. It almost looked like a dirty, tangled net, but it was too irregular for netting. It was more like a thick, tattered cobweb. "That wasn't there before," Elodin said apologetically as he pulled his feet free of the grey sand. "It was much more dramatic the first time, let me assure you." I simply stood, stunned by what I'd just seen. This wasn't sympathy. This wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. All I could think of was the old line from 100 half-remembered stories. "And Tarbolin the Great said to the stone, 'Break,' and the stone broke." Elodin wrenched off one of the chair's legs and used it to batter at the tangled green web that stretched across the opening. Parts of it broke easily or flaked away. Where it was thicker, he used the leg as a lever to bend pieces aside. Where it bent or broke, it glimmered bright in the sunlight. More copper, I thought. Veins of copper running through the blocks of stone that made the wall. Elodin dropped the chair leg and ducked through the gap. Through the window, I saw him lean against the white stone railing on the balcony. I followed him outside. As soon as I stepped onto the balcony, the air no longer felt strangely heavy and still. 2 years, he said, looking out over the garden. "Able to see this balcony but not stand on it. Able to see the wind but not hear it, not feel it on my face." He swung one leg up over the stone railing, so he was sitting on it, then dropped a few feet to land on the flat piece of roof just underneath. He wandered out across the roof, away from the building. I hopped the rail myself and followed him to the edge of the roof. We were only about 20 feet up, but the gardens and fountains spreading out on all sides made for a spectacular view. Elodin stood perilously near the edge, his master's robe flapping around him like a dark cloud. He looked rather impressive, actually, if you were willing to ignore the fact that he was still only wearing one sock. I went to stand beside him on the edge of the roof. I knew what my third question had to be. "What do I have to do," I asked, "to study naming under you?" He met my eye calmly, appraising me. "Jump," he said. "Jump off this roof." That's when I realized that all of this had been a test. Elodin had been taking my measure ever since we met. He had a grudging respect for my tenacity, and he had been surprised that I noticed something odd about the air in his room. He was on the verge of accepting me as a student, but he needed more proof of my dedication, a demonstration, a leap of faith. And as I stood there, a piece of story came to mind. So Taborlin fell, but he did not despair, for he knew the name of the wind, and so the wind obeyed him. It cradled and caressed him. It bore him to the ground as gently as a puff of thistledown. It set him on his feet, softly as a mother's care. Elodin knew the name of the wind. Still looking him in the eye, I stepped off the edge of the roof. Elodin's expression was marvelous. I have never seen a man so astonished. I spun slightly as I fell, so he stayed in my line of vision. I saw him raise one hand slightly as if making a belated attempt to grab hold of me. I felt weightless, like I was free. Then I struck the ground. Not gently, like a feather settling down, hard, like a brick hitting a cobblestone street. I landed on my back with my left arm beneath me. My vision went dark as the back of my head struck the ground and all the air was driven from my body. I didn't lose consciousness. I just lay there, breathless and unable to move. I remember thinking quite earnestly that I was dead, that I was blind. Eventually my sight returned, leaving me blinking against the sudden brightness of the blue sky. Pain tore through my shoulder and I tasted blood. I couldn't breathe. I tried to roll off my arm, but my body wouldn't listen to me. I had broken my neck, my back. After a long, terrifying moment, I managed to gasp a shallow breath. Then another. I gave a sigh of relief and realized that I had at least one broken rib in addition to everything else. But I moved my fingers slightly, then my toes. They worked. I hadn't broken my spine. As I lay there, counting my blessings and broken ribs, Elodin stepped into my field of vision. He looked down at me. "Congratulations," he said. "That was the stupidest thing I've ever seen." His expression was a mix of awe and disbelief. Ever. And that is when I decided to pursue the noble arts of artificing. Not that I had a lot of other options. Before helping me limp to the Medica, Elodin made it clear that anyone stupid enough to jump off a roof was too reckless to be allowed to hold a spoon in his presence, let alone study something as profound and volatile as naming. Nevertheless, I wasn't terribly put out by Elodin's refusal. Storybook magic or no, I was not eager to study under a man whose first set of lessons had left me with 3 broken ribs, a mild concussion, and a dislocated shoulder. Chapter 47. Barbs. Aside from its rocky start, my first term went fairly smoothly. I studied in the Medica, learning more about the body and how to heal it. I practiced my Siaru with Willem, and helped him with his Arturan in exchange. I joined the ranks of the artificery, studying how to blow glass, mix alloys, draw wire, inscribe metal, and sculpt stone. Most evenings I came back to Kilvin's workshop to work. I chipped casings off bronze castings, washed glassware, and ground ore for alloys. It was not demanding work, but every span Kilvin gave me a copper job, sometimes two. I suspected there was a great tally board in that methodical mind of his, carefully marking down the hours each person worked. I learned things of a less academic nature as well. Some of my Arcanum bunkmates taught me a card game called Dog's Breath. I returned the favor by giving an impromptu lesson on psychology, probability, and manual dexterity. I won almost 2 whole talents before they stopped inviting me back to their games. I became tight friends with Willem and Simon. I had some few others, but not many and none so close as Will and Sim. My swift rise to Elia alienated me from most of the other students. Whether they resented or admired me, most students held themselves apart. And there was Ambrose. To deem us simply enemies is to lose the true flavor of our relationship. It was more like the two of us entered into a business partnership in order to more efficiently pursue our mutual interest of eating each other. However, even with my vendetta against Ambrose, I still had a great deal of time on my hands. Since I wasn't able to spend it in the archives, I spent some time nurturing my budding reputation. You see, my dramatic entrance to the university had made quite a stir. I'd made my way into the Arcanum in 3 days instead of the usual 3 terms. I was the youngest member by almost 2 years. I had openly defied one of the masters in front of his own class and avoided expulsion. When whipped, I hadn't cried out or bled. On top of everything else, I had apparently managed to infuriate Master Elodine to such an extent that he had thrown me off the roof of the crockery. I let that story circulate uncorrected, as it was preferable to the embarrassing truth. Altogether, it was enough to start a steady stream of rumor around me, and I decided to take advantage of it. Reputation is like a sort of armor, or a weapon you can brandish if needed. I decided that if I was going to be an arcanist, I might as well be a well-known arcanist. So I let slip a few pieces of information. I had been admitted without a letter of recommendation. The masters had given me 3 talents to attend, rather than make me pay a tuition. I had survived for years on the streets of Tarbine, living off my wits. I even started a few rumors that were pure nonsense. Lies so outrageous that people would repeat them despite the fact that they were obviously untrue. I had demon blood in me. I could see in the dark. I only slept an hour each night. When the moon was full, I would talk in my sleep, speaking a strange language no one could understand. Basil, my former bunkmate from Muse, helped me start these rumors. I would make up the stories, he would tell a few people, then together we would watch them spread like a fire in a field. It was an amusing hobby. But my ongoing feud with Ambrose added to my reputation more than anything else. Everyone was stunned that I dared openly defy a powerful noble's firstborn son. We had several dramatic encounters that first term. I won't bore you with the details. We'd cross paths and he would make some offhand comment loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, or he would sneer at me under the guise of a compliment. "You must tell me who cuts your hair." Anyone with a lick of common sense knew how to deal with arrogant nobility. The tailor I had terrorized back in Tarbine knew what to do. You take your lumps, duck your head, and get the whole thing over as quickly as possible. But I always fought back. And while Ambrose was intelligent and reasonably well-spoken, he was no match for my trooper's tongue. I'd been raised on the stage, and my sharp, rude wits ensured that I got the better of our exchanges. Still, Ambrose continued to seek me out like a dog too stupid to avoid a porcupine. He would snap at me and leave with a face full of barbs, and each time we parted ways, we hated each other just a little more. People noticed, and by the end of the term, I had a reputation for reckless bravery. But the truth is, I was merely fearless. There's a difference, you see. In Tarbeen, I'd learned real fear. I feared hunger, pneumonia, guards with hobnail boots, older boys with bottle glass knives. Confronting Ambrose required no real bravery on my part. I simply couldn't muster any fear of him. I saw him as a puffed-up clown. I thought he was harmless. I was a fool. Chapter 48. Interlude. A silence of a different kind. Bast sat in the Waystone Inn and tried to keep his hands motionless in his lap. He had counted 15 breaths since both had spoken last, and the innocent silence that had gathered like a clear pool around the three men was beginning to darken into a silence of a different kind. Bast took another breath, 16, and braced himself against the moment he feared would come. It would not be to Bast's credit to say that he was afraid of nothing, as only fools and priests are never afraid, but it is true that very few things unnerved him. Heights, for instance, he didn't care for very much, and the great summer storms that came through these parts that blackened the sky and tore up deep-rooted oaks made him feel uncomfortably small and helpless. But when you come down to it, nothing really frightened him. Not storms, not tall ladders, not even a scrael. Bast was brave by being largely fearless. Nothing would turn him pale, or if it did, he didn't stay pale for very long. Oh, certainly he didn't relish the thought of someone hurting him, stabbing him with bitter iron, searing him with hot coals, that sort of thing. But just because he didn't like the thought of his blood on the outside didn't mean he was really afraid of those things. He just didn't want them to happen. To really fear something, you have to dwell on it. And since there was nothing that preyed on Bast's waking mind in this fashion, there was nothing his heart truly feared. But hearts can change. 10 years ago, he had lost his grip climbing a tall Rennell tree to pick fruit for a girl he fancied. After he slipped, he had hung for a long minute, head down, before falling. In that long minute, a small fear rooted inside him and had stayed with him ever since. In the same way, Bast had learned a new fear of late. A year ago, he had been fearless as any sane man can hope to be, but now Bast feared silence. Not the ordinary silence that came from the simple absence of things moving about and making noise. Bast feared the deep, weary silence that gathered around his master at times, like an invisible shroud. Bast breathed in again. 17. He fought not to wring his hands as he waited for the deep silence to invade the room. He waited for it to crystallize and show its teeth on the edges of the cool quiet that had pooled in the Waystone. He knew how it came, like the frost that bleeds out of the winter ground, hardening the clear water that an early thaw leaves in wagon ruts. But before Bast could draw another breath, Kvothe straightened in his chair and made a motion for Chronicler to lay down his pen. Bast nearly wept as he sensed the silence scatter like a dark bird, startled into flight. Kvothe gave a sigh that hovered between annoyance and resignation.
I will admit,
He said,
I am not sure how to approach the next part of the story.
Afraid to let the silence stretch for too long, Bast chirruped, "Why don't you simply talk about what is most important first? Then you can go back and touch on other things if you need to."
As if it were as simple as that.
Kvothe said sharply.
What is most important? My magic or my music? My triumphs or my follies?
Bast flushed deep crimson and bit his lips. Kvothe let out his breath in a sudden rush.
I am sorry, Bast.
It's good advice, as all of your seemingly inane advice turns out to be. He pushed his chair back from the table. But before we continue, the real world has certain calls on me that I can no longer ignore. If you will please excuse me for a moment. Chronicler and Bast stood as well, stretching their legs and attending to calls of their own. Bast lit the lamps. Quoth produced more cheese and bread and hard spiced sausage. They ate, and some small effort was made at polite conversation, but their minds were elsewhere, dwelling on the story. Bast ate half of everything. Chronicler accounted for a sizable, though more modest amount. Quoth had a bite or two before he spoke. Onward then. Music and magic, triumph and folly. Think now. What does our story need? What vital element is it lacking? Women, Reshi, Bast said immediately. There's a real paucity of women. Quoth smiled. Not women, Bast. A woman. The woman. Quoth looked at Chronicler. You have heard bits and pieces, I don't doubt. I will tell you the truth of her, though I fear I may not be equal to the challenge. Chronicler picked up his pen, but before he could dip it, Quoth held up a hand. Let me say one thing before I start. I have told stories in the past, painted pictures with words, told hard lies and harder truths. Once, I sang colors to a blind man. 7 hours I played, but at the end he said he saw them green and red and gold. That, I think, was easier than this. Trying to make you understand her with nothing more than words. You have never seen her, never heard her voice. You cannot know. Quoth motioned for Chronicler to pick up his pen. But still I will try. She is in the wings now, waiting for her cue. Let us set the stage for her arrival. Chapter 49. The Nature of Wild Things. As with all truly wild things, care is necessary in approaching them. Stealth is useless. Wild things recognize stealth for what it is, a lie and a trap. While wild things might play games of stealth, and in doing so may even occasionally fall prey to stealth, they are never truly caught by it. So, with slow care, rather than stealth, we must approach the subject of a certain woman. Her wildness is of such degree, I fear approaching her too quickly, even in a story. Should I move recklessly, I might startle even the idea of her in sudden flight. So in the name of slow care, I will speak of how I met her. And to do that, I must speak of the events that brought me quite unwillingly across the river and into London. I finished my first term with 3 silver talents and a single job. Not long ago, it would have seemed like all the money in the world to me. Now I simply hoped it would be enough for 1 more term's tuition and a bunk in the Muse. The last span of every term at the university was reserved for admissions exams. Classes were cancelled and the masters spent several hours of each day conducting examinations. Your next term's tuition was based on your performance. A lottery determined what day and hour you would go through admissions. A great deal hung on the brief interview. Missing a few questions could easily double your tuition. Because of this, slots later in the span were highly prized as they gave students more time to study and prepare. There was a vigorous trade in appointment times after the lottery was held. Money and favors were bartered as everyone vied for a time that suited them. I was lucky enough to draw a mid-morning hour on Kenley, the last day of admissions. If I'd wanted to, I could have sold my slot, but I preferred to take the extra time to study. I knew my performance would have to be brilliant, as several of the masters were now less than impressed by me. My previous trick of spying was out of the question. I now knew it was grounds for expulsion, so I couldn't expand. Despite the long days I spent studying with Will and Sim, admissions were difficult. I breezed through many of the questions, but Heme was openly hostile, asking questions with more than one answer so that nothing I said could be correct. Brandia was difficult as well, clearly helping Heme carry his grudge. Lauren was unreadable, but I sensed his disapproval rather than seeing it on his face. Afterwards I fidgeted while the masters discussed my tuition. Voices were calm and muted at first, then became somewhat louder. Eventually, Kilvin stood and shook her finger at Heme while shouting and pounding the table with his other hand. Heme maintained more composure than I would have if I had been faced with 20 stone of furious bellowing artificer. After the Chancellor managed to regain control of things, I was called forward and given my receipt.
Elecworth, fall term. Tuition, 3 talents, 9 jots, 7 drabs.
8 jots more than I had. As I walked out of the Master's Hall, I ignored the sinking feeling in my gut and tried to think of a way I could lay hands on more money by tomorrow noon. I made a brief stop at the 2 Kael'dish money changers on this side of the river. As I suspected, they wouldn't lend me a thin chin. While I wasn't surprised, the experience was sobering, reminding me again of how different I was from the other students. They had families paying their tuition, granting them allowances to cover their living expenses. They had reputable names they could borrow against in a pinch. They had possessions they could pawn or sell. If worse came to worst, they had homes to return to. I had none of these things. If I couldn't come up with 8 more jots for tuition, I had nowhere in the world I could go. Borrowing from a friend seemed like the simplest option, but I valued my handful of friends too much to risk losing them over money. As my father used to say, there are 2 sure ways to lose a friend. One is to borrow, the other to lend. Besides, I did my best to keep my desperate poverty to myself. Pride is a foolish thing, but it is a powerful force. I wouldn't ask him for money except as my very last resort. I briefly considered trying to cut-purse the money, but I knew it was a bad idea. If I were caught with my hand in someone's pocket, I would get more than a cuff round the head. At best, I'd be jailed and forced to stand against the iron law. At worst, I'd end up on the horns and expelled for conduct unbecoming a member of the Arcanum. I needed a Gaelet, one of the dangerous men who lend money to desperate people. You might have heard them referred to romantically as copperhawks, but more often they're referred to as shimgors or lets. Regardless of the name, they exist everywhere. The hard part is finding them. They tend to be rather secretive, as their business is semi-legal at best. But living in Tarbeen had taught me a thing or two. I spent a couple of hours visiting the seedier taverns around the university, making casual conversations, asking casual questions. Then I visited a pawn shop called the Bent Penny and asked a few more pointed questions. Finally, I learned where I needed to go. Over the river. To Imre. Chapter 50. Negotiations. Imre lay a little over 2 miles from the university on the eastern side of the Omethi River. Since it was a mere 2 days in a fast coach from Tarbeen, a great many wealthy nobles, politicians, and courtiers made their homes there. It was conveniently close to the governing hub of the Commonwealth, while being a comfortable distance from the smell of rotten fish, hot tar, and the vomit of drunken sailors. Imre was a haven for the arts. There were musicians, dramatists, sculptors, dancers, and the practitioners of 100 other smaller arts, even the lowest art of all, poetry. Performers came because Imre offered what every artist needs most, an appreciative, affluent audience. Imre also benefited by its proximity to the university. Access to plumbing and sympathy lamps improved the quality of the town's air. Quality glass was easy to come by, so windows and mirrors were commonplace. Eyeglasses and other ground lenses, while expensive, were readily available. Despite this, there was little love lost between the two towns. Most of Imre's citizens did not like the thought of 1,000 minds tinkering with dark forces better left alone. Listening to the average citizen speak, it was easy to forget that this part of the world had not seen an arcanist burned for nearly 300 years. To be fair, it should be mentioned that the university had a vague contempt for Imre's populace too, viewing them as self-indulgent and decadent. The arts that were viewed so highly in Imre were seen as frivolous by those at the university. Often students who quit the university were said to have gone over the river, the implication being that minds that were too weak for academia had to settle for tinkering with the arts. And both sides of the river were ultimately hypocrites. University students complained about frivolous musicians and fluffhead actors, then lined up to pay for performances. Imre's population griped about unnatural arts being practiced 2 miles away, but when an aqueduct collapsed or someone fell suddenly sick, they were quick to call on engineers and doctors trained at the university. All in all, it was a long-standing and uneasy truce, where both sides complained while maintaining a grudging tolerance. Those people did have their uses after all. You just wouldn't want your daughter marrying one. Since Imre was such a haven for music and drama, you might think I spent a great deal of time there, but nothing could be further from the truth. I had been there only once. Willem and Simon had taken me to an inn where a trio of skilled musicians played, lute, flute and drum. I bought a short beer for a halfpenny and relaxed, fully intending to enjoy an evening with my friends. But I couldn't. Bare minutes after the music started, I practically fled the room. I doubt very much you'll be able to understand why, but I suppose I have to explain if things are to make any sense at all. I couldn't stand being near music and not being a part of it. It was like watching the woman you love bedding down with another man. No, not really. It was like the sweet eaters I'd seen in Tarbin. Denner resin was highly illegal, of course, but that didn't matter in most parts of the city. The resin was sold wrapped in waxy paper like a sucking candy or a toffee. Chewing it filled you with euphoria, bliss, contentment, but after a few hours, you were shaking, filled with a desperate hunger for more, and that hunger grew worse the longer you used it. Once in Tarbin, I saw a young girl of no more than 16 with the telltale hollow eyes and unnaturally white teeth of the hopelessly addicted. She was begging a sailor for a sweet, which he held tauntingly out of reach. He told her it was hers if she stripped naked and danced for him, right here in the street. She did, not caring who might be watching, not caring that it was nearly midwinter and she stood in 4 inches of snow. She pulled off her clothes and danced desperately, her thin limbs pale and shaking, her movements pathetic and jerky. Then, when the sailor laughed and shook his head, she fell to her knees in the snow, begging and weeping, clutching frantically at his legs, promising him anything, anything. That is how I felt, watching the musicians play. I couldn't stand it. The everyday lack of my music was like a toothache I had grown used to. I could live with it, but having what I wanted dangled in front of me was more than I could bear. So I avoided Imre until the problem of my second term's tuition forced me back across the river. I had learned that Devi was the person anyone could ask for a loan, no matter how desperate the circumstances. So I crossed the Omethi by Stonebridge and made my way to Imre. Devi's place of business was through an alley and up a narrow balcony staircase behind a butcher's shop. This part of Imre reminded me of Waterside in Tarbin. The cloying smell of rancid fat from the butcher shop below made me thankful for the cool autumn breeze. I hesitated in front of the heavy door, looking down into the alley. I was about to become involved in dangerous business. A Caeldish moneylender could take you to court if you didn't repay your loan. A Gaelic would simply have you beaten, or robbed, or both. This was not smart. I was playing with fire. But I didn't have any better options. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and knocked on the door. I wiped my sweaty palms against my cloak, hoping to keep them reasonably dry for when I shook Devi's hand. I had learned in Tarbeen that the best way to deal with this type of man was to act with confidence and self-assurance. They were in the business of taking advantage of other people's weakness. I heard the sound of a heavy bolt being drawn back. Then the door opened, revealing a young girl with straight strawberry blonde hair framing a pixie-like face. She smiled at me, cute as a new button. Yes? I'm looking for Devi, I said. You found her, she said easily. Come on in. I stepped inside and she closed the door behind her, sliding the iron bolt home. The room was windowless, but well lit and filled with the scent of lavender, a welcome change from the smell of the alley. There were hangings on the walls, but the only real furniture was a small desk, a bookshelf, and a large canopy bed with the curtains drawn around it. Please, she said, gesturing to the desk. Have a seat. She settled herself behind the desk, folding her hands across the top. The way she carried herself made me rethink her age. I'd misjudged her because of her small size, but even so, she couldn't be much older than her early 20s. Hardly what I had expected to find. Devi blinked prettily at me. I need a loan, I said. How about your name first? She smiled. You already know mine. Quoth. Really? She arched an eyebrow. I've heard a thing or two about you. She looked me up and down. I thought you'd be taller. I could say the same. I was caught off balance by the situation. I'd been ready for a muscular thug and negotiations filled with thinly veiled threats and bravado. I didn't know what to make of this smiling waif. What have you heard? I asked to fill the silence. Nothing bad, I hope. Good and bad, she grinned, but nothing boring. I folded my hands to keep from fidgeting. So, how exactly do we do this?
Interesting.
Oh, not much for banter, are you? She said, giving a brief, disappointed sigh. Fair enough. Straight to business, how much do you need? Only about a talent, I said. 8 jots, actually. She shook her head seriously, her strawberry blonde hair swinging back and forth. I can't do that, I'm afraid. It's not worth my while to make halfpenny loans.
Glad I could help.
I frowned. How much is worth your while? 4 talents, she said. That's the minimum. And the interest? 50% every 2 months. So if you're looking to borrow as little as possible, it'll be 2 talents at the end of the term. You can pay off the whole debt for 6 if you like, but until I get all the principal back, it's 2 talents every term. I nodded, not terribly surprised. It was roughly 4 times what even the most avaricious moneylender would charge. But I'm paying interest on money I don't really need. No, she said, meeting my eyes seriously. You're paying interest on money you borrowed. That's the deal. How about 2 talents? I said. Then at the end, Devi waved her hands, cutting me off. We aren't bargaining here. I'm just informing you as to the conditions of the loan.
Yeah, what do you want?
She smiled apologetically. I'm sorry I didn't make that clear from the beginning. I looked at her, the set of her shoulders, the way she met my eyes. Okay, I said, resigned. Where do I sign? She gave me a slightly puzzled look, her forehead furrowing slightly. No need to sign anything. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small brown bottle with a glass stopper. She laid a long pin next to it on the desk. Just a little blood. I sat, frozen in my chair, my arms at my sides. Don't worry, she reassured me. The pin's clean. I only need about 3 good drops. I finally found my voice. Got to be kidding. Devi cocked her head to one side. a tiny smile curling one edge of her mouth. You didn't know, she said, surprised. It's rare that anyone comes here without knowing the whole story. I can't believe anyone actually... I stalled, at a loss for words. Not everyone does, she said. I usually do business with students and ex-students. Folk on this side of the river would think I was some sort of witch or a demon or some nonsense like that. Members of the Arcanum know exactly why I want blood and what I can do with it. You're a member of the Arcanum too? Former, she said, her smile fading a little. I made Raylar before I left. I know enough so that with a little blood, you can never hide from me. I can douse you out anywhere. Among other things, I said incredulously, thinking of the wax mommet I had made of Heme at the beginning of the term. That was just hair. Blood was much more effective at creating a link. You could kill me. She gave me a frank look. You're awfully thick to be the Arcanum's bright new star. Think it through. Would I stay in business if I made a habit of malfeasance? The masters know about this? She laughed. Oh, God's body, of course not. Neither does the constable, the bishop, or my mother. She pointed to her chest, then to me. I know, and you know. That's usually enough to ensure a good working relationship between the two of us. What about unusually? I asked. What if I don't have your money at the end of term? What then? She spread her hands and shrugged carelessly. Then we work something out between the two of us, like rational people. Maybe you work for me, tell me secrets, do me favors. She smiled and gave me a slow, lecherous looking over, laughing at my discomfiture. If worse comes to worst and you end up being extraordinarily uncooperative, I could probably sell your blood to someone to recover my loss. Everyone has enemies. She shrugged easily. But I've never had things descend to that level. The threat is usually enough to keep people in line. She looked at the expression on my face and her shoulders slumped a little. Come on now, she said gently. You came here expecting some thick-necked Gaelet with scarred knuckles. You were ready to make a deal with someone ready to beat 12 distinct colours of hell out of you if you were a day late. My way is better. Simpler. This is insane, I said, getting to my feet. Absolutely not. Devi's cheerful expression faded. Get a hold of yourself, she said, plainly growing exasperated. You're acting like some farmer who thinks I'm trying to buy his soul. It's just a little blood so I can keep tabs on you. It's like collateral. She made a calming gesture with both hands as if smoothing the air.
Talk to me.
Fine. I'll tell you what. I'll let you borrow half the minimum. She looked at me expectantly. 2 talents. Does that make it easier? No, I said. I'm sorry to have wasted your time, but I can't do it. Are there any other Gaelets around? Of course, she said coolly, but I don't feel particularly inclined to give out that sort of information. She tilted her head quizzically. By the way, today's Kendling, isn't it? Don't you need your tuition by noon tomorrow? I'll find them on my own then, I snapped. I'm sure you will, clever boy like you. Devi waved me away with the back of her hand. Feel free to let yourself out. Think fond thoughts of Devi in 2 months' time when some thug is kicking the teeth out of your pretty little head. After leaving Devi's, I paced the streets of Imre restless and irritated, trying to get my thoughts in order, trying to think of a way around my problem. I had a decent chance of paying off the 2-talent loan. I hoped to move up the ranks in the fishery soon. Once I was allowed to pursue my own projects, I could start earning real money. All I needed was to stay in classes long enough. It was just a matter of time. That's really what I was borrowing. Time. One more term. Who knew what opportunities might present themselves in the next 2 months? But even as I tried to talk myself into it, I knew the truth. It was a bad idea. It was begging for trouble. I would swallow my pride and see if Will or Sim or Savoy could lend me the 8 drops I needed. I sighed, resigning myself to a term of sleeping outside and scavenging meals where I could find them. At least it couldn't be worse than my time in Tarbeen. I was just about to head back to the university when my restless pacing took me by a pawn shop's window. I felt the old ache in my fingers. "How much for the 7-string lute?" I asked. To this day, I do not remember actually entering the store. "4 talents even," the owner said brightly. I guessed he was new to the job or drunk. Pawnbrokers are never cheerful, not even in rich cities like Imre. "Ah," I said, not bothering to hide my disappointment. "Could I take a look at it?" He handed it over. It wasn't much to look at. The grain of the wood was uneven, the varnish rough and scratched, its frets were made of gut and badly in need of replacing. But that was of little concern to me, as I typically played fretless anyway. The bowl was rosewood, so the sound of it wouldn't be terribly subtle, but on the other hand, rosewood would carry better in a crowded tap room, cutting through the murmur of idle conversation. I tapped the bowl with a finger, and it gave off a resonant hum, solid but not pretty. I began to tune it so I would have an excuse to hold it a while longer. "I might be able to go as low as 3 and 5, the man behind the counter said. My ears pricked up as I heard something in his tone. Desperation. It occurred to me that an ugly, used lute might not sell very well in a city full of nobility and prosperous musicians. I shook my head. "The strings are old." Actually, they were fine, but I hoped he didn't know that. "True," he said, reassuring me of his ignorance. "But strings are cheap." "I suppose," I said doubtfully. With a deliberate plan, I set each of the strings just a hair out of tune with the others. I struck a chord and listened to the grating sound. I gave the lute's neck a sour, speculative look. "I think the neck might be cracked." I strummed a minor chord that sounded even less appealing. "Does that sound cracked to you?" I strummed it again, harder. 3 and 2? He asked, hopefully. "It's not for me," I said, as if correcting him. "It's for my little brother. The little bastard won't leave mine alone." I strummed again and grimaced. "I may not like the little sprit very much, but I'm not cruel enough to buy him a lute with a sour neck." I paused significantly. When nothing was forthcoming, I prompted him. "Not for 3 and 2? 3 even?" he said hopefully. To all appearances, I held the lute, casually, carelessly, but in my heart I was clutching it with a white-knuckled fierceness. I cannot hope for you to understand this. When the Chandrian killed my troop, they destroyed every piece of family and home I had ever known. But in some ways it had been worse when my father's lute was broken in Tarbeen. It had been like losing a limb, an eye, a vital organ.
You need something?
Without my music, I had wandered Tarbeen for years half alive, like a crippled veteran, or one of the walking dead. "Listen," I said to him frankly, "I've got 2 and 2 for you." I pulled out my purse. "You can take it, or this ugly thing can gather dust on a high shelf for the next 10 years. I met his eye, careful to keep my face from showing how badly I needed it. I would do anything to keep this lute. I would dance naked in the snow. I would clutch at his legs, shaking and frantic, promising him anything. I counted out 2 talents and 2 jots onto the counter between us, nearly all of the money I had saved for this term's tuition. Each coin made a hard click as I pressed it to the table. He gave me a long look, measuring me. I clicked down 1 more jot and waited. And waited. When he finally reached out his hand for the money, his haggard expression was the same one I was used to seeing on pawnbrokers' faces. Devi opened the door and smiled. "Well now, I honestly didn't think I'd see you again. Come in." She bolted the door behind me and walked over to her desk. "I can't say I'm disappointed, though." She looked over her shoulder and flashed her impish smile. "I was looking forward to doing a little business with you." She sat down. "So, 2 talents then?" 4 would be better, actually," I said. "Just enough for me to afford tuition and a bunk in the mews." I could sleep outside in the wind and rain. My loot deserved better. "Wonderful," she said as she pulled out the bottle and pin. I needed the tips of my fingers intact, so I pricked the back of my hand and let 3 drops of blood slowly gather and fall into the small brown bottle. I held it out to Devi. "Go ahead and drop the pin in there too." I did. Devi swabbed the bottle's stopper with a clear substance and slid it into the mouth of the bottle. "A clever little adhesive from your friends over the river," she explained. "This way I can't open the bottle without breaking it. When you pay off your debt, you get it back intact and can sleep safe knowing I haven't kept any for myself." "Unless you have the solvent," I pointed out. Devi gave me a pointed look. "You're not big on trust, are you?" She rummaged around in a drawer, brought out some sealing wax and began to warm it over the lamp on her desk. "I don't suppose you have a seal or ring or anything like that?" she asked as she smeared the wax across the top of the bottle stopper. "If I had jewelry to sell, I wouldn't be here," I said frankly, and pressed my thumb into the wax. It left a recognizable print. "But that should do." Devi etched a number on the side of the bottle with a diamond stylus, then brought out a slip of paper. She wrote for a moment, then fanned it with a hand, waiting for it to dry. "You can take this to any moneylender on either side of the river," she said cheerfully, as she handed it to me. "Pleasure doing business with you. Don't be a stranger." I headed back to the university with money in my purse and the comforting weight of the loot strap hanging from my shoulder. It was second-hand, ugly, and had cost me dearly in money, blood, and peace of mind. I loved it like a child, like breathing, like my own right hand. Chapter 51. Tar and Tin. At the beginning of my second term, Kilvin gave me permission to study sigildry. This raised a few eyebrows, but none in the fishery, where I'd proven myself to be a hard worker and a dedicated student. Sigildry, simply put, is a set of tools for channeling forces, like sympathy made solid. For example, if you engraved one brick with the rune Ul and another with the rune Doch, the 2 runes would cause the bricks to cling to each other as if mortared in place. But it's not as simple as that. What really happens is the 2 runes tear the bricks apart with the strength of their attraction. To prevent this, you have to add the rune Aru to each of the bricks. Aru is the rune for clay, and it makes the 2 pieces of clay cling to each other, solving your problem. Except that Aru and Doch don't fit together. They're the wrong shape. To get them to fit, you have to add a few linking runes, Geya and Teh. Then, for balance, you have to add Geya and Teh to the other brick too. Then the bricks cling to each other without breaking. But only if the bricks are made out of clay. Most bricks aren't, so generally it is a better idea to mix iron into the ceramic of the brick before it is fired. Of course, that means you have to use Faire instead of Aru. Then you have to switch Teh and Geya so the ends come together properly. As you can see, mortar is a simpler and more reliable route for holding bricks together. I studied my sigildry under Kamar. The scarred, one-eyed man was Kilvin's gatekeeper. Only after you were able to prove your firm grasp of sigildry to him could you move on to a loose apprenticeship with one of the more experienced artificers. You assisted them with their projects, and in return, they showed you the finer points of the craft. There were 197 runes. It was like learning a new language, except there were nearly 200 unfamiliar letters, and you had to invent your own words a lot of the time. Most students took at least a month of study before Kamar judged them ready to move on. Some students took an entire term. Start to finish, it took me 7 days. How? First, I was driven. Other students could afford to stroll through their studies. Their parents or patrons would cover the expense. I, on the other hand, needed to climb the ranks in the fishery quickly so I could earn money working on my own projects. Tuition wasn't even my first priority anymore. Devi was. Second, I was brilliant. Not just your run-of-the-mill brilliance either. I was extraordinarily brilliant. Lastly, I was lucky. Plain and simple. I stepped across the patchwork rooftops of Mainz with my loot slung across my back. It was a dim, cloudy twilight, but I knew my way around by now. I kept to the tar and tin, knowing that red tiles or grey slate made treacherous footing. At some point in the remodelling of Mainz, one of the courtyards had become completely isolated. It could only be accessed by clambering through a high window in one of the lecture halls or by climbing down a gnarled apple tree, if you happened to be on the roof. I came here to practice my loot. My bunk in Mews was not convenient. Not only was music viewed as frivolous on this side of the river, but I would only make more enemies by playing while my bunkmates tried to sleep or study. So I came here. It was perfect, secluded, and practically on my doorstep. The hedges had gone wild and the lawn was a riot of weeds and flowering plants. But there was a bench under the apple tree that was perfectly suited to my needs. Usually I came late at night when Mainz was locked and abandoned, but today was Theoden. That meant that if I ate dinner quickly, I had nearly an hour between Elksadal's class and my work in the fishery. Plenty of time for some practice. However, when I reached the courtyard tonight, I saw lights through the windows. Brandier's lecture was running late today. So I stayed on the rooftop. The windows to the lecture hall were shut, so there wasn't much chance of my being overheard. I put my back to a nearby chimney and began to play. After about 10 minutes, the lights went out, but I decided to stay where I was rather than waste time climbing down. I was halfway through 10 Tap Tim when the sun slipped out from behind a cloud. Golden light covered the rooftop, spilling over the edge of the roof into a thin slice of the courtyard below. That's when I heard the noise. A sudden rustling, like a startled animal down in the courtyard. But then there was something else. A noise unlike anything a squirrel or rabbit would make in the hedge. It was a hard noise, a vaguely metallic thud, as if someone had dropped a heavy bar of iron. I stopped playing, the half-finished melody still running through my head. There's another student down there, listening. I put my loot back in its case before I made my way over to the lip of the roof and looked down. I couldn't see through the thick hedge that covered most of the eastern edge of the courtyard. Had a student climbed through the window? The sunset was fading quickly, and by the time I made it down the apple tree, most of the courtyard lay in shadow. I could see from here that the high window was closed. No one had come in that way. Even though it was quickly growing dark, curiosity won over caution, and I made my way into the hedge. There was quite a lot of space there. Portions of the hedge were nearly hollow, a green shell of living branches, leaving enough room to crouch comfortably. I made note of the place as a good space for sleeping if I didn't have enough money for a bunk in the Mews next term. Even in the fading light, I could see I was the only one there. There wasn't room for anything bigger than a rabbit to hide. In the dim light, I couldn't spot anything that could have made the metallic noise either. Humming the catchy chorus of 10 Tap Tim, I crawled through to the other end of the hedge. Only when I came through the other side did I notice the drainage grate. I'd seen similar ones scattered throughout the university, but this one was older and larger. In fact, the opening might be large enough for a person to fit through if the grate were removed. Hesitantly, I curled a hand around one of the cool metal bars and pulled. The heavy grate pivoted on a hinge and came up about 3 inches before stopping. In the dim light, I couldn't tell why it wouldn't go any further. I pulled harder, but couldn't budge it. Finally, I gave up and dropped it back into place. It made a hard noise, vaguely metallic, like someone had dropped a heavy bar of iron. Then my fingers felt something that my eyes missed. A maze of grooves etching the surface of the bars. I looked closer and recognized some of the runes I was learning under Kamar. I laughed. Then something clicked in my head. the chorus of 10 tapped hymns suddenly fit together with the runes I'd been studying under Kama for the last handful of days. Ule and Doch are both for binding, Re for seeking, Kel for finding, Gea ki te lock, Pesin water, resin rock. Before I could go any further, 6 the bell struck. The sound startled me from my reverie, but when I reached out to steady myself, my hand didn't come to rest on leaves and dirt. It touched something round and hard and smooth. A green apple. I emerged from the hedge and made my way to the northwest corner where the apple tree stood. No apples were on the ground. It was too early in the year for that. What's more, the iron grate was on the opposite side of the small courtyard. It couldn't have rolled that far. It must have been carried. Unsure of what to think, but knowing I was late for my evening shift in the fishery, I climbed the apple tree, gathered up my loot, and hurried to Kilbin's shop. Later that night, I fit the rest of the runes to music. It took a few hours, but when I was done, it was like having a reference sheet in my head. The next day, Kama put me through an extensive 2-hour examination, which I passed. For the next stage of my education in the fishery, I was apprenticed to Manet, the old, wild-haired student I'd met during my first days at the university. Manet had been attending the university for nearly 30 years, and everyone knew him as the eternal Elir. But despite the fact that we held the same rank, Manet had more hands-on experience in the fishery than any dozen higher-ranking students combined. Manet was patient and considerate. In fact, he reminded me of my old teacher, Abenthi. Except Abenthi had wandered the world like a restless tinker, and it was common knowledge that Manet desired nothing more than to stay at the university for the rest of his life, if he could manage it. Manet started small, teaching me simple formulae of the sort required for twice tough glass and heat funnels. Under his tutelage, I learned artificing as quickly as I learned anything, and it wasn't long before we worked our way up to more complex projects like heat eaters and sympathy lamps. Truly high-level artificing, such as sympathy clocks or gear winds, were still beyond my reach, but I knew that it was just a matter of time. Unfortunately, time was proving to be in short supply. Chapter 52. Burning. Owning a lute again meant I had my music back, but I quickly realized I was 3 years out of practice. My work in the artificery over the last couple of months had toughened and strengthened my hands, but not in entirely the right ways. It took several frustrating days before I could play comfortably for even an hour at a time. I might have progressed more quickly had I not been so busy with my other studies. I had 2 hours of each day in the Medica, running or standing an average of 2 hours of lecture and ciphering each day in mathematics, and 3 hours of studying under Manet in the fishery, learning the tricks of the trade. And then there was advanced sympathy with Elk Sadal. Out of class, Elk Sadal was charming, soft-spoken, and even a little ridiculous when the mood was on him. But when he taught, his personality strode back and forth between mad prophet and galley slave drummer. Every day in his class, I burned another 3 hours of time and 5 hours worth of energy. Combined with my paid work in Kilbin's shop, this left me with barely enough time to eat, sleep, and study, let alone give my lute the time it deserved. Music is a proud, temperamental mistress. Give her the time and attention she deserves, and she is yours. Slight her, and there will come a day when you call, and she will not answer. So I began sleeping less, to give her the time she needed. After a span of this schedule, I was tired. After 3 span, I was still fine, but only through a grim, set-jaw type of determination. Somewhere around the 5th span, I began to show definite signs of wear. It was during that 5th span that I was enjoying a rare shared lunch with Willem and Simon. They had their lunches from a nearby tavern, I couldn't afford a drab for an apple and meat pie, so I had snuck some barley bread and a gristly sausage out of the mess. We sat on the stone bench beneath the pennant pole where I'd been whipped. The place had filled me with dread after my whipping, but I forced myself to spend time there to prove to myself that I could. After it no longer unnerved me, I sat there because the stares of the students amused me. Now I sat there because I was comfortable. It was my place. And because we spent a fair amount of time together, it had become Willem and Simon's place too. If they thought my choice an odd one, they didn't speak of it.
You haven't been around very much,
Willem said around a mouthful of meat pie.
Been sick.
Right, said Simon sarcastically.
He's been sick a whole month.
Willem glared at him and grumbled, reminding me of Kilvin for a moment. His expression made Simon laugh.
Ha! Will's more polite than I am. I'm betting you've been spending all your free hours walking to Imre and back, courting some fabulously attractive young bard.
He gestured at the loot case that lay at my side.
He looks like he's been sick.
Willem looked at me with a critical eye.
Your woman hasn't been taking care of you.
He's lovesick, Simon said knowingly.
Can't eat, can't sleep. You think of her when you should be trying to memorize your cipher.
I couldn't think of anything to say.
See?
Simon said to Will.
She's stolen his tongue as well as his heart. All his words are for her. He can spare none for us. Can't spare any time either,
Willem said, into his rapidly dwindling meat pie. It was true, of course. I had been neglecting my friends even more than I had been neglecting myself. I felt a flush of guilt wash over me. I couldn't tell them the full truth, that I needed to make the most of this term because it would very likely be my last. I was flat broke. If you cannot understand why I couldn't bring myself to tell them this, then I doubt you have ever been truly poor. I doubt you can really understand how embarrassing it is to only own 2 shirts, to cut your own hair as best you can because you can't afford a barber. I lost a button and couldn't spare a shim to buy a matching one. I tore out the knee of my pants and had to make do with the wrong color thread for mending. I couldn't afford salt for my meals or drinks on my rare evenings out with friends. The money I earned in Kilvin's shop was spent on essentials, ink, soap, lute strings. The only other thing I could afford was pride. I couldn't bear the thought of my 2 best friends knowing how desperate my situation was. If I suffered a piece of extraordinary good luck, I might be able to muster 2 talents to pay the interest on my debt to Devi, but it would require a direct act of God for me to somehow gather enough money to pay that and next term's tuition as well. After I was forced out of the university and squared my debt with Devi, I didn't know what I'd do. Pull up stakes and head for Annalyn to look for Denna, perhaps. I looked at them, not knowing what to say. Well, Simon, I'm sorry, it's just that I've been so busy lately. Simon grew a little more serious, and I saw that he was earnestly hurt at my unexplained absence.
We're busy too, you know. I've got rhetoric and chemistry, and I'm learning Siaru.
He turned to Will and scowled.
You should know I'm beginning to hate your language, you shim bastard.
To Kralum, the young Keeld replied amiably. Simon turned back to me and spoke with remarkable candour.
It's just that we'd like to see you more often than once every handful of days as you run from Mains to the fishery. Girls are wonderful, I'll admit, but when one takes one of my friends away, I get a little jealous.
He gave a sudden sunny smile.
Not that I think of you in that way, of course.
I found it hard to swallow past the sudden lump in my throat. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been missed. For a long time I hadn't had anyone to miss me. I felt the beginning of hot tears in the back of my throat.
Really, there isn't a girl.
I mean it. I swallowed hard, trying to regain my composure.
Sim, I think we've been missing someone here.
Willem was looking at me oddly.
Take a good look at him.
Simon gave me a similar, analytical stare. That look from the 2 of them was enough to unnerve me, pushing me back from the edge of tears. Now, Willem said as if lecturing, how many terms has our young Elir been attending the university? Realization poured into Sim's honest face. Oh. Anyone care to tell me? I said petulantly. Willem ignored my question. What classes are you taking? Everything, I said, glad to have an excuse to complain. Geometry, observation in the Medica, advanced sympathy with Elxadal, and I've got my apprenticeship under Manet in the fishery. Simon looked a little shocked. No wonder you look like you haven't slept in a span of days, he said. Willem nodded to himself. And you're still working in Kelvin's shop, aren't you? A couple of hours every night. Simon was aghast. And you're learning an instrument at the same time. Are you insane? The music is the only thing that keeps me grounded, I said, reaching down to touch my lute. And I'm not learning to play, I just need practice. Willem and Simon exchanged looks. How long do you think he has? Simon looked me over. Span and a half, tops. What do you mean? Willem leaned forward. We all bite off too much sooner or later. But some students don't know when to spit their mouthful. They burn out, they quit, or botch their exams. Some crack. He tapped his head. It usually happens to students in their first year. He gave me a significant look. I haven't bitten off too much, I said. Look in a mirror, Willem suggested frankly. I opened my mouth to reassure Will and Sim that I was fine, but just then I heard the hour being struck, and I only had time for a hurried goodbye. Even so, I had to run to make it to advanced sympathy on time. Elxadal stood between two medium-sized braziers. In his well-trimmed beard and dark master's robe, he still reminded me of the stereotypical evil magician that appears in so many bad Aturan plays.
What each of you must remember is that the sympathist is tied to flame,
he said.
We are its master and its servant.
He tucked his hands into his long sleeves and began to pace again.
We are the masters of fire, for we have dominion over it.
Elxadal struck a nearby brazier with the flat of his hand, making it ring softly. Flames kindled in the coal and began to lick hungrily upward.
The energy in all things belongs to the Arcanus. We command fire, and fire obeys.
Dahl walked slowly to the other corner of the room. The brazier at his back dimmed while the one he walked towards sparked to life and began to burn. I appreciated his showmanship. Dahl stopped and faced the class again.
But we are also servants of fire, because fire is the most common form of energy, and without energy our prowess as sympathists is of little use.
He turned his back to the class and began erasing formulae from his slate board.
Gather your materials, and we'll see who has to knock heads with Elia Kvoth today.
He began to chalk up a list of all the students' names. Mine was at the top. 3 span ago, Dahl had started making us compete against each other. He called it dueling, and though it was a welcome break from the monotony of lecture, this most recent activity had a sinister element too. 100 students left the Arcanum every year, perhaps a quarter of them with their guilders. That meant that every year there were 100 more people in the world that had been trained in the use of sympathy. People who, for one reason or another, you might have to pit your will against later in life. Though Dahl never said as much, we knew we were being taught something beyond mere concentration and ingenuity. We were being taught how to fight. Elxadal kept careful track of the results. In a class of 38, I was the only one to remain undefeated. By this point, even the most thick-headed and grudging students were being forced to admit that my quick admittance to the Arcanum was something other than a fluke. Dueling could also be profitable in a small way, as there was a bit of clandestine betting. When we wanted to bet on our own duels, Savoy and I placed bets for each other, though as a rule I usually didn't have much money to spare. Thus it was no coincidence that Savoy and I bumped into each other while we were gathering our materials. I handed him 2 jots underneath the table. He slid them into his pocket without looking at me.
Goodness, he said quietly. Someone's pretty confident today.
I shrugged nonchalantly, though in truth I was a little nervous. I had started the term penniless and been scraping by ever since. But yesterday Kilvin had paid me for a span's work in the fishery, 2 jots, all the money I had in the world. Savoy began to rummage around in a drawer, bringing out sympathy wax, twine, and a few pieces of metal.
I don't know how well I'll be able to do for you. The odds are getting bad. I'm guessing 3 to 1 is the best you'll get today. You still interested if it gets that low?
I sighed. The odds were the downside to my undefeated rank. Yesterday they had been 2 to 1, meaning I would have had to risk 2 pennies for the chance to win 1. I've got a little something planned, I said. Don't bet until we've set terms. You should get at least 3 to 1 against me.
Against you?
He muttered as he gathered up an armful of paraphernalia.
Not unless you're going up against Dahl.
I turned my face to conceal a slightly embarrassed blush at the compliment. Dahl clapped his hands and everyone rushed to take their proper place. I was paired with a vintage boy, Fenton. He was 1 step below me in the class ranking. I respected him as one of the few in the class that could pose a real challenge to me in the right situation.
Right then, Elxadal said, rubbing his hands together eagerly. Fenton, you're lower on the ranks. Pick your poison.
Candles.
And your link?
Dahl asked ritualistically. With candles it was always either wicking or wax.
Wick.
He held up a piece for everyone to see. Dahl turned to me.
Link?
I dug into a pocket and held up my link with a flourish. Straw! There was a murmur from the class at this. It was a ridiculous link. The best I could hope for is 3% transfer, maybe 5. Fenton's wicking would be 10 times better.
Straw.
Straw, I said with slightly more confidence than I felt. If this didn't tip the odds against me, I didn't know what would.
Straw it is, then,
Dahl said easily.
Elia Fenton, since Quoth is undefeated, you will have the choice of sauce.
A quiet laugh spread through the class. My stomach dropped. I hadn't expected that. Normally, whoever doesn't pick the game gets to choose the sauce. I had been planning on choosing brazier, knowing that the quantity of heat would help offset my self-imposed handicap. Fenton grinned, knowing his advantage.
No sauce.
I grimaced. All we would have to draw from was our own body heat. Difficult in the best of circumstances, not to mention a little dangerous. I couldn't win. Not only was I going to lose my perfect rank, I had no way to signal Savoy not to bet my last 2 drafts. I tried to meet his eyes, but he was already caught up in quiet, intense negotiations with a handful of other students. Fenton and I moved wordlessly to sit on opposite sides of a large work table. Elxadal set 2 thick stumps of candle down, 1 in front of each of us. The object was to light your opponent's candle without letting him do the same to yours. This involved splitting your mind into 2 different pieces. 1 piece tried to hold the Allah that your piece of wicking, or straw if you were stupid, was the same as the wick of the candle you were trying to light. Then you drew energy from your source to make it happen. Meanwhile, the second piece of your mind was kept busy trying to maintain the belief that your opponent's piece of wicking was not the same as the wick of your candle. If all of this sounds difficult, believe me, you don't know the half of it. Making it worse was the fact that neither of us had an easy source to draw from. You had to be careful using yourself as a source. Your body is warm for a reason. It responds badly when its heat is pulled away. At a gesture from Elxadal, we began. I immediately devoted my whole mind to the defense of my own candle and began to think furiously. There was no way I could win. It doesn't matter how skilled a fencer you are, you can't help but lose when your opponent has a blade of Ramston steel, and you've chosen to fight with a willow switch. I lowered myself into the heart of stone. Then, still devoting most of my mind to the protection of my candle, I muttered a binding between my candle and his. I reached out and tipped my candle on its side, forcing him to make a grab for his before it did the same and rolled away. I tried to take quick advantage of his distraction and set his candle aflame. I threw myself into it and felt a chill bleed up my arm from my right hand that held the piece of straw. Nothing happened. His candle remained cold and dark. I cupped my hand around the wick of my candle, blocking his line of sight. It was a pretty trick and largely useless against a skilled sympathist, but my only hope was to rattle him in some way. "Hey, Fen," I said, "have you heard the one about the tinker, the tellin, the farmer's daughter, and the butter churn yet?" Fen gave no response. His pale face was locked in fierce concentration. I gave up distraction as a lost cause. Fenton was too smart to be thrown off that way. Besides, I was finding it difficult to maintain the necessary concentration to keep my candle safe. I lowered myself more deeply into the heart of stone and forgot the world apart from the 2 candles and a piece of wick and straw. After a minute, I was covered in a clammy, chill sweat. I shivered. Fenton saw this and gave me a smile with bloodless lips. I redoubled my efforts, but his candle ignored my best attempts to force it into flame. 5 minutes passed, with the whole class quiet as stones. Most duels lasted no longer than a minute or 2, one person quickly proving himself more clever or possessed of a stronger will. Both my arms were cold now. I saw a muscle in Fenton's neck twitch spastically like a horse's flank trying to shake loose a biting fly. His posture went rigid as he suppressed the urge to shiver. A wisp of smoke began to curl from the wick of my candle. I bore down. I realized that my breath was hissing through my clenched teeth, my lips pulled back in a feral grin. Fenton didn't seem to notice, his eyes growing glassy and unfocused. I shivered again so violently that I almost missed seeing the tremor in his hand. Then, slowly, Fenton's head began to nod toward the tabletop. His eyelids drooped. I set my teeth and was rewarded to see a thin curl of smoke rise from the wick of his candle. Woodenly, Fenton turned to look, but instead of rallying to his own defense, he made a slow, leaden gesture of dismissal and lay his head in the crook of his arm. He didn't look up as the candle near his elbow spat fitfully to life. There was a brief scattering of applause mixed in with exclamations of disbelief. Someone pounded me on the back.
How about that? Wore himself out.
"No," I said thickly and reached across the table. With clumsy fingers, I prized open the hand that held the wicking and saw it had blood on it. "Master Dahl," I said as quickly as I could manage. "He's got the chills." Speaking made me realize how cold my lips felt. But Dahl was already there, bringing a blanket to wrap around the boy.
"You,"
he pointed to one of the students at random.
"bring someone from the medical, go."
The student left at a run.
"Foolish,"
Master Dahl murmured, a binding for heat. He looked over at me.
"You should probably walk around a bit. You don't look much better than he does."
There was no more dueling that day. The rest of the class watched as Fenton revived slowly under Elxa Dahl's care. By the time an older Elfte from the Medica arrived, the Fenton had warmed enough to begin shivering violently. After a quarter of an hour of warm blankets and careful sympathy, Fenton was able to drink something hot, though his hands still shook. Once all the hubbub was finished, it was nearly 3rd bell. Master Dahl managed to get all the students seated and quiet long enough to say a few words.
"What we saw today was a prime example of binder's chills. The body is a delicate thing, and a few degrees of heat lost rapidly can upset the entire system. A mild case of chills is just that, chilling, but more extreme cases can lead to shock and hypothermia."
Dahl looked around.
"Can anyone tell me what Fenton's mistake was?"
There was a moment of silence, then a hand raised.
"Yes, Bray?"
He used blood. When heat is lost from the blood, the body cools as a whole unit. This is not always advantageous, as the extremities can stand a more drastic temperature loss than the viscera can. Why would anyone consider using blood, then? It offers up more heat more rapidly than the flesh. How much would have been safe for him to draw? Dahl looked around the room. 2 degrees? Someone volunteered. 1.5, Dahl corrected, and wrote a few equations on the board to demonstrate how much heat this would provide. Given his symptoms, how much do you suppose he actually drew? There was a pause. Finally, Sovoy spoke up. 8 or 9. Very good, Dahl said grudgingly. It's nice that at least one of you has been doing the reading. His expression grew grave. Sympathy is not for the weak of mind, but neither is it for the overconfident. If we had not been here to give Fenton the care he needed, he would have slipped quietly asleep and died. He paused to let the words sink in. Better you should know your honest limit than overguess your abilities and lose control. Third bell struck, and the room was filled with sudden noise as students stood to leave. Master Dahl raised his voice to be heard. Elia Quoth, would you mind staying behind for a moment? I grimaced. Sovoy walked behind me, clapped me on the shoulder, and muttered, Luck. I couldn't tell if he was referring to my victory or wishing me well. After everyone was gone, Dahl turned and set down the rag he had been using to wipe the slate clean. So, he said conversationally, how did the numbers work out? I wasn't surprised he knew about the betting. 11-1, I admitted. I'd made 22 jots, a little over 2 talents. The presence of that money in my pocket warmed me. He gave me a speculative look. How are you feeling? You were a little pale at the end yourself. I had a little shiver. I lied. Actually, in the commotion that followed Fenton's collapse, I had slipped out and had a frightening few minutes in a back hallway. Shivers that were close to seizures had made it almost impossible to stay on my feet. Luckily, no one had found me shaking in the hallway, my jaw clenched so tight that I feared my teeth might break. But no one had seen me. My reputation was intact. Dahl gave me a look that told me he might suspect the truth. Come over. He made a motion to one of the still burning braziers. A little warmth won't hurt you. I didn't argue. As I held my hands to the fire, I felt myself relax a bit. Suddenly I realized how weary I was. My eyes were itchy from too little sleep. My body felt heavy as if my bones were made of lead. With a reluctant sigh, I pulled my hands back and opened my eyes. Dahl was looking closely at my face. I've got to go, I said with a little regret in my voice. Thanks for the use of your fire. We're both sympathists, Dahl said, giving me a friendly wave as I gathered my things and headed for the door. You're welcome to it, anytime. Later that night in the mews, Willem opened his door to my knocking. I'll be damned, he said. 2 times in one day, to what do I owe the honour? I think you know, I grumbled and pushed my way inside the cell-like little room. I leaned my loot case against a wall and fell into a chair. Kilvin has banned me from my work in the shop. Willem sat forward on his bed. Why's that? I gave him a knowing look. I expect it's because you and Simon stopped by and suggested it to him. He watched me for a moment, then shrugged. You figured it out quicker than I thought you would. He rubbed the side of his face. You don't seem terribly upset. I had been furious. Just as my fortune seemed to be turning, I was forced to leave my only paying job because of well-intentioned meddling by my friends. But rather than storm over and rage at them, I'd gone away to the roof of Mainz and played for a while to cool my head. My music calmed me, as it always did,
and while I played, I thought things through. My apprenticeship with Manet was going well, but there was simply too much to learn. How to fire the kilns, how to draw wire to the proper consistency, which alloys to choose for the proper effects. I couldn't hope to bull through it the way I had learning my runes. I couldn't earn enough working in Kilvin's shop to pay back Devi at the end of the month, let alone make enough for tuition too. I probably would be, I admitted, but Kilvin made me look in a mirror. I gave him a tired smile. I look like hell. You look like beat up hell? He corrected me matter-of-factly, then paused awkwardly. I'm glad you're not upset. Simon knocked as he pushed the door open. Guilt chased surprise off his face when he saw me sitting there. Aren't you supposed to be, in the fishery? He asked lamely. I laughed, and Simon's relief was almost tangible. Willem moved a stack of paper off another chair, and Simon slouched into it. All is forgiven, I said magnanimously. All I ask is this. Tell me everything you know about the Aeolian.
So, as tired as Coase is, I'm tired too. I don't think I play on today, but I take a nap for sure now, and let's see, but most likely I will come back tomorrow. So, have a nice time.